They called her Barren. They stripped her seal. They handed her husband to a prettier blade and watched her disappear into the frost like smoke off a dead fire. 7 years of loyalty, gone in one night, because the court decided her womb was the problem. But here's what kingdoms never learn until it's too late. The woman they bury in silence is the one who survives to burn everything down. Stay until the end. You will not see this coming. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from. The night they took her seal, Selene did not weep. She had learned long before that night, in the cold schoolrooms of her father's war keep, in the sharp-tongued courts of the Varelion nobility, in 7 years of sleeping beside a man whose eyes had slowly stopped seeing her, that weeping was something you did alone or not at all. You did not give them the satisfaction of watching your face come apart. You did not hand them that currency. So when Vaelor's chancellor placed the ivory document on the council table and slid it toward her with 2 fingers, the way a man might move something unclean out of his path, Selene pressed her hands flat against the carved wood and kept her spine straight and read every word. Royal decree, dissolution of queenly authority, effective at dawn. You'll have time to gather your personal effects, the chancellor said. His name was Drevis, and he had a habit of tugging at his left cuff when he was nervous. He was tugging now. His Majesty has arranged for an escort to the southern estate. Selene looked up from the parchment. Which southern estate? A pause. The kind that told her everything before the words arrived. The Ashenfield property, Your Grace, near the border. Near the border. Ashenfield was a crumbling manor 3 days' ride from anyone who mattered, close enough to the grave-ass territories that even bandits avoided the road leading to it. It was not a residence. It was a disappearance with furniture. Where is he? She asked. Drevis tugged the cuff again. His Majesty is indisposed this evening. Indisposed. Yes, Your Grace. She let the silence sit between them long enough to make him sweat. Then she pushed the decree back toward him, stood, and walked out of the council chamber without another word. Her footsteps echoed off the stone corridor, steady and measured, and she did not look back. The night was bitter cold and sharp with pine smoke. The palace torches threw orange shadows across the courtyard stones, and somewhere beyond the iron gates, the capital city of Kareth hummed with its ordinary night sounds. Tavern noise, horses, the distant bark of a watch patrol. The Empire was asleep. The Empire did not know. Selene stood in the outer corridor where the wind came through the gaps in the wall, and she pressed her back against the stone, and she put her hand flat against her stomach. She had known for 3 weeks. She had not told him. She had told no one. Because even in those first days, when the nausea rolled through her at dawn and she lay very still in her bed counting her breaths, she understood something that her heart did not want to accept, but her mind had already confirmed. The court did not want an heir from her. They wanted a reason to remove her, and an heir was not a shield. An heir was a target they would find 100 ways to eliminate before it drew its first breath. 3 weeks, and now this. She pressed her hand harder against her stomach. Then she went to pack. She took almost nothing, a traveling cloak. Her mother's ring, the plain iron one that looked like it belonged to a tradesman's wife. A knife with a handle worn smooth from years of her mother's grip, passed down with the simple instruction, don't hesitate. 2 dresses, plain ones, dark fabric, nothing that announced rank. A small wooden box she kept locked, containing the only letters she had kept from 7 years of correspondence with a woman named Liza, who lived with her small family in the fortress territories beyond the Frostfang Mountains, who owed Selene a debt she had never collected. She would collect it now. She left the palace before the escort came for her. The guard at the eastern postern was a young man named Brace, who had been posted there 3 months ago, and who Selene had spoken to exactly twice, once to ask after his mother's illness, and once to bring him a hot meal during a night when the temperature had dropped so sharply that the iron torch brackets had cracked. He was 19 years old and deeply uncertain about everything. When she appeared out of the dark corridor with her traveling sack and held his gaze in the quiet, he did not call for anyone. He looked at the stones beneath his feet. I didn't see anything, he said. No, she agreed. You didn't. She walked out into the black pre-dawn and did not look back at the palace. Later, she would understand that she had been afraid that if she looked, she would not have kept walking. The road north out of Kerith was empty at that hour, and Selene moved fast using the service lanes that merchants use to avoid the toll bridges. She had silver enough for a horse from a livery 3 streets off the main road, a gray animal with a hard mouth and no patience, which suited her perfectly. She rode until the capital's glow dropped behind the hills, and then she rode harder. By the time the sun came up cold and white over the eastern ridge, she was past the border of the Kerith territory entirely. She stopped at a roadside well to water the horse and let the reality settle into her bones the way cold always did. Gradually, without mercy, working inward until you felt it in your chest. She was exiled. She was alone. She was carrying the heir to the Iron Throne inside her body, and no one in the Empire knew it existed. She leaned over the well and let herself think clearly, which was the only thing she had ever been genuinely good at. Not sentiment, not politics, not the careful social performance that court required, but the cold machinery of thinking when everything was on fire. What she knew. The child existed and was healthy, at least as far as she could determine. She was 3 weeks along, and her body had not been gentle about announcing it. What she knew, Maevra Voss was already installed in the court's favor, and Maevra came from a war clan with long arms and a habit of solving problems permanently. If word reached anyone in that palace that Selene was with child, the problem would be solved before the pregnancy showed. What she knew. Lysa's fortress beyond the Frostfangs was remote enough to be forgotten, positioned in a territory the Empire administered but never closely watched. Too cold, too far, too little worth taxing. What she needed, time, distance, and someone who understood the cost of silence. She straightened up, remounted the gray horse, and turned north. The Frostfang Mountains took 11 days to reach at the pace she could manage. She stopped in small settlements, paid for rooms in her iron ring and a false name, and moved before dawn each time. Her body was not cooperative. The nausea came at odd hours and left her gripping whatever surface was nearest until it passed. She ate what she could stomach, bread, dried fruit, warm water when she could get it. She slept badly and woke ahead of her alarm each morning, one hand already on the knife. On the 8th night, she was sick for 2 hours in the back of a livery stable while the horses shifted and stamped in their stalls. And when it was over, she sat in the hay with her knees pulled up and looked at the dark ceiling and felt, for the first time, something break open inside her. Not grief. Grief she had been managing. This was something else. She was angry. Not at Vaelor, although that was in there too, somewhere deep and structural, the kind of anger that doesn't flame. It calcifies. What she felt in that stable was a cleaner thing, pure fury at what had been done to her body, to her choices, to the careful and deliberate stripping of every decision she might have otherwise made. They had taken 7 years. They had taken her seal, her name's weight, her standing in a court she had spent a decade learning to navigate. They had decided what she was capable of producing before she had known herself what was inside her. They had been so certain. She put her hand against her stomach in the dark stable, feeling the straw against her palm through the fabric. "I'm going to keep you safe," she said quietly, "to no one and to someone. Whatever that costs, whatever I have to build or destroy, you're not going to be a piece on their board." The horses shifted. The wind came through the stable boards. She got up, washed her face in the trough water, and went back to sleep. On the 11th day, she crossed the last ridge and saw the Frostfang fortress below her in the pale morning light. Lysa was a small woman, 42 years old, with hands like iron and eyes that had stopped trusting anything without evidence. She had served the old Varelion court before Vaelor's ascension, in the capacity of record keeper for the royal archives, which meant she had spent 12 years watching powerful people bury things they did not want found. She knew where things were hidden. She also knew that knowing where things were hidden was the most dangerous thing a person could possess. When Selene appeared at her gates at dawn with a gray horse and a changed name and dark circles under her eyes, Lysa took one long look at her and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll put the fire up." They sat at Lisa's kitchen table while the kettle heated, and Selene laid out the situation without softening it. She was practiced at that now, the bare architecture of facts without the emotion, because the emotion wasn't useful yet and would only cloud what needed to be clear. Lisa listened to all of it without interrupting. When Selene finished, the older woman turned her cup in her hands and said, "You know what you're asking." "I know what I'm asking. If they find out I sheltered you, this fortress ends. My people end." "They won't look here," Selene said. "I was sent to the Ashenfield property. As far as anyone in that palace knows, I'm rotting in a crumbling manor near the Grey-Vast border, too humiliated to cause problems. Vaelor will check eventually." "Vaelor will be very occupied," Selene said flatly. "He's about to marry Maevra Voss. That will require his complete attention. Maevra will make certain of it." Lisa looked at her steadily. "And the child?" Selene met her gaze without flinching. "The child was never born in the palace," she said. "The child was never part of their record. As far as every official document in that empire is concerned, I was barren. I left without producing an heir. That is the story. I intend to let them keep it." A long silence. "You understand what you're giving up," Lisa said. Not a question, a wait. "I understand what I'm choosing," Selene replied. "There's a difference." Lisa set down her cup. She looked at the fire. Then she looked back. "You'll need the East Wing," she said. "It's defensible and far enough from the training yard that the noise won't carry. I'll put Wren on watch rotation. She doesn't talk." Selene exhaled once, deep and controlled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Lisa said. "Just make sure whatever you're growing in there is worth the trouble." Chet. Kaelin was born in early winter, 6 months after Selene arrived at the fortress, in the cold stone room of the East Wing, with only Lisa and a midwife named Dort in attendance. The labor was long and brutal, and Selene did not make noise she could suppress. When it was over, she lay back in the damp sheets with her chest heaving and heard the first cry, and for a moment the entire calcified structure of her discipline cracked clean through. She did not weep for long, but she did weep. Lisa placed the boy in her arms, and Selene looked at him, red-faced, furious at the world, eyes screwed shut, and felt something settle into her that had been disordered for a very long time. Then the boy opened his eyes. Dort made a sound, low and involuntary, like someone who has seen something they cannot immediately account for. The child's eyes were silver, not gray. Silver, the sharp, bright silver of new-drawn steel, and in the dark they caught the candlelight and held it in a way that was not quite natural. And beneath his skin, faint but unmistakable, a faint pulse of golden light moved through the veins of his wrist like current moving through water. Selene had read about it. Every child of the royal bloodline had read about it, the same way they read about the old wars and the extinct fauna of the Western continent, as history, as legend, as a thing that no longer existed in the world, because the world was not what it had been 4 centuries ago. The golden blood. She looked at her son's wrist and watched the pulse of light move under his skin, and she understood that everything she thought she had been preparing for had been insufficient. "Don't say it out loud," she said to Dort, who had gone very still. Dort nodded. Her face was white. "Not ever. Not to anyone." Selene looked at the woman directly. "I will pay you well to forget what you saw tonight. If payment isn't sufficient, tell me what is." Dort swallowed. "I have a daughter in the Greth settlements. She's been indentured to a mill." "I'll have her out before spring," Selene said, "and positioned. She'll have work and a wage and no one coming for her debt." Dort nodded again, and this time the motion was steadier. Selene looked back at her son. He had settled now, eyes open, watching her with an attention that no newborn should have possessed. The gold light moved under his wrist and cast a faint warmth against her palm. "Kaelin," she said quietly. The name she had chosen alone, weeks ago, from a language so old that the court scholars no longer taught it. In the old tongue, it meant the one who holds. She had not known why it had seemed right. Now she did. She pressed her lips to his forehead. "You are not their weapon," she told him. "You are not their throne. You are not their proof of anything." The candle guttered. The gold pulse under his wrist glowed steady as a heartbeat. "Rachet." The years moved the way years do in exile. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular texture of days that have weight. The fortress became a life. Selene learned its rhythms, the way the wind shifted before snow, the schedule of the watch rotation, which of Lysa's people were sharp and which were loyal and which were both. She learned the land around the fortress in a 5-mile radius, every trail and frozen stream and stand of old pine, the same way she had once learned the palace corridors, as a matter of survival rather than pleasure. She worked. She was not a woman who could fill time decoratively, had never been able to manage the court preference for elegant idleness. She took inventory. She trained with the fortress guard because she needed to know what she was capable of if something came, and because standing still made her think too much. Lysa taught her what she knew about the fortress accounts, and Selene restructured them, quietly identifying 3 years of embedded waste that had been bleeding the stores dry. By the second winter, the fortress was running leaner and safer than it had in a decade. At night, once Kaelin was down, she sat by the fire and read. Not court documents now. She had no access to those. But history. The deep kind that predated Vaelor's dynasty. The kind that recorded not just wars, but the mechanics of how power moved from one hand to another, and why some movements stuck and others collapsed under their own weight. She studied betrayal the way a surgeon studied anatomy. And Kaelin grew. He was a serious child from the first month, attentive, almost unnerving in his capacity to simply watch things before engaging with them. He was not silent. He had opinions, loudly held, and a stubborn streak that Selene recognized with a complicated feeling she did not examine too closely. But his attention to the world had a quality that she had never observed in any child before. He seemed to be processing at a level several steps ahead of what his body could yet execute. By the time he was walking, he had developed a habit of sitting very still in the training yard and watching the guard wolves. Lysa kept a small pack for protection, and the wolves returned the attention with a focused calm they did not give anyone else. By the time he was talking clearly, the pack's alpha had taken to sleeping at the threshold of his room. By the time he was 4, 2 of the ancient timber wolves from the deep forest had appeared at the fortress gates, enormous pale things with scarred muzzles and size that suggested bloodlines going back before the Empire's founding, and they had simply sat down and waited until someone let them in. Wren, who kept watch and didn't talk, said nothing about it, but her face said plenty. Selene catalogued each occurrence and kept her own counsel. She did not know what the golden blood meant in practice. The old texts were fragmentary, composed in an era before careful record-keeping, but she understood the pattern. The boy was not merely rare. He was something the world had not prepared for in a very long time. She made sure the fortress walls stayed thick. She made sure no traveler lingered long enough to ask questions. She made sure Kaelin's existence remained in the category of local rumor rather than documented fact. And she made sure he knew how to be a person before anything else. "What am I?" he asked her once when he was 5 and sitting beside her near the fire on a winter evening, watching the light move under his wrist with the calm curiosity of a child who has grown up alongside a mystery. She had been waiting for the question. "You're mine," she said. He looked at her sideways, the silver eyes catching the firelight. He was not satisfied with that, and she knew it. "The wolves come to me," he said. "They don't come to anyone else." "No." "Why?" She thought about how to answer this, not about what to hide, because she had decided very early that she would not raise a child on lies, only on the careful sequencing of truth, and finally said, "Because something in your blood remembers what wolves remember. Old things, deep things, the kind that run in both of you." He considered this. "Is that dangerous?" "Most powerful things are," she said. "The danger isn't the power, it's whether you understand what it's for." "What's it for?" She looked at him steadily. "We'll find out." He nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer, because at 5, with a mother who said what she meant and meant what she said, it was reasonable. It was the most honest thing she had available, and he was old enough to feel the difference between honesty and comfort, even if he could not yet name it. She pulled him in against her side, and they sat quiet while the fire worked down and the pack wolves outside shifted in the snow. The merchant came through in the autumn of Kaelin's 6th year. He was a trader in dried goods, moving between the Frostfang settlements and the larger towns to the southeast. A talkative man with an easy manner who stayed 2 nights and paid decently and talked too much, as some people do when they've been alone on the road. Selene let him talk. She listened to the parts that mattered. Trade prices were shifting. Northern routes were becoming difficult since the new tariff negotiations. Lord Castle's territory was restless, some kind of internal dispute about succession terms. The capital was celebrating the upcoming royal wedding. Lady Maevra Voss, yes, magnificent woman, so they said, though the merchant himself had only seen her procession from a distance. Beautiful and cold, he said, the way expensive things were cold. Selene kept her face pleasant and non-committal and noted each piece of information. Then the merchant said, almost as an afterthought, the way people said things they'd heard so many times they'd stopped registering whether they were interesting. Funny thing about the old queen, isn't it? Word is Vaelor's physician turned up some kind of poisoning, old poisoning, years old. Selene set down her cup very carefully. What kind of poisoning? She asked, in a tone she had spent years refining. Light and curious, just enough interest to not seem strange. Oh, some court scandal thing. The merchant waved a hand. Moonroot something. Clan Voss business, allegedly. Before the lady was official, suppressed some function or other to weaken the old queen's position. You know how court people are. He shrugged. Probably nothing. Kings don't like admitting they were played for fools in their own house, so they'll bury it. He took a long drink of his ale and moved on to complaining about road conditions. Selene looked at the fire across the room. She sat with what she had just heard and did not speak for a long time, which the merchant did not notice because he was still talking. Moonroot ash, suppressed fertility. Years of it. Years of whispers about her barren womb in a court full of people who had studied her blood and pronounced her lacking, and all of it. Every council meeting, every priest's murmur, every noblewoman's fan hiding her contempt, had been constructed on a foundation that someone had built deliberately. She had been poisoned. She had been poisoned so that the verdict of her body could be used against her, so that the court's patience with her could be engineered into intolerance, so that when the moment came and the decree was placed on the table, the ground had already been prepared for the conclusion. Maevra Voss had been operating years in advance. That was real fear, Selene thought, watching the fire. Not the reactive kind, not the flinching kind, the architectural kind, the fear that calculates years out and builds scaffolding for outcomes. That kind of fear was what Vaelor should have been afraid of in his own house, and he had not seen it because he had been looking at the wrong woman. So had she, in a way. She went to bed that night and lay very still in the dark, and she thought about what the merchant had not said, that Vaelor knew. That the physician's discovery had reached the king's ears, that the king had done the accounting. If he was doing the accounting, he would eventually reach the item in the ledger that included Selene's disappearance from the Ashenfield property. He would reach the blank line where she had been and the road north that led nowhere official. It was time to think harder about what came next. 3 weeks later, in the cold gray morning just after the first snow, Kaelin was in the training yard with the pack wolves when the boy stopped mid-movement. He had been chasing one of the younger wolves through the yard in the way children did, more noise than strategy. And then he simply stopped, stood very still in the snow with his arms at his sides, and turned slowly toward the south. Ren, who had been watching from the walkway, came down the steps without a word and stood beside Selene. He's been doing that for 3 days, Ren said quietly. Turning south. Selene watched her son stand in the snow, utterly still, silver eyes fixed on something none of them could see. Does he say why? Said there's something moving, Ren said. Something that smells like iron and old blood. The golden pulse under Kaelin's wrist was visible even from where they stood. That evening, after the boy was fed and asleep with the old timber wolves settled outside his door, Selene stood at the fortress's highest window and looked south at the dark line of the Frostfang ridges. It was Lysa who came up beside her, who had a habit of appearing when things needed to be said, and no one was quite saying them yet. I've had word from my contact at Threnvast, Lisa said. Her voice was flat, the voice she used when the information was not good. 3 days ago, a royal dispatch left Kareth. 40 riders, northern route. Selene did not look away from the mountains. Headed where? Far enough north to pass through the Frostfang territory. A long silence. One dispatch? Or multiple? One. But my contact said the riders were armed for more than a diplomatic errand. Lisa paused. Vaelor knows you didn't go to Ashenfield. He knows I went north. He knows more than that, Lisa said carefully. There have been stories circulating the trade routes. A silver-eyed child, wolves bowing in the snow. You know how stories carry. Selene turned from the window. Her face was calm. It was the particular calm that came from the understanding that preparation had been sufficient, that she had thought this through, that she had built what she could build, and now the moment had arrived for which all of it had been practice. She was not ready in the way that meant comfortable. She was ready in the way that meant she had run out of time and had used it correctly. Wake Ren, she said, and get me the fortress maps. Lisa moved toward the door. Selene, she said, pausing. Yes. If Vaelor arrives here before Maevra's people, he won't arrive as a rescue, Selene said. Don't mistake reclamation for care. He's coming because he believes something belongs to him. And if he decides the child belongs to him? Selene looked at the older woman steadily. Let him try, she said. She turned back to the window. Below in the yard, the timber wolves had moved to the south-facing wall and were standing in a row in the dark, still and immense as carved stone, their heads pointing south toward the ridgeline. In the east wing room, through the stone walls and the cold air, a faint golden light pulsed against the dark. She had 61 people in this fortress. She had walls that were thick and defensible. She had a child who bent the old world around himself without knowing he was doing it. She had 7 years of survival behind her and a mind that had stopped flinching at hard calculation. She had one night, maybe two, before whatever was coming reached the Frostfang passes. And in the morning, the wolves began to howl before the sun came up. Long, low, carrying sounds that traveled the mountain air without echo, that reached the sleeping fortress and pulled everyone out of their beds before the watch bell rang. That was when the smoke appeared on the southern ridge. Not one fire, 6. The smoke on the southern ridge was not a signal fire. Selene knew the difference. Signal fires burned vertical. Controlled columns meant to be read from distance. These 6 fires burned wide and low, the kind of spread that came from something structural consuming itself. Whatever was on that ridge had not been set deliberately. It had been destroyed. She stood at the fortress gates with the cold morning air cutting through her cloak and ran the calculation fast and without sentiment. 6 points of fire across a 10-mile span. That was not Vaelor's style. He moved with precision, not spectacle. 40 riders following a royal dispatch did not torch villages on their route north. Vaelor understood that burning the road behind you was something you did when you intended to come through only once, which meant someone else had passed through first. Ren. She did not raise her voice. Ren was already at her shoulder. I see it. How many riders came through Threnvast on the eastern route in the last week? My contact only tracked the royal dispatch. Ren's jaw was tight. There could have been others moving through the mountain passes without hitting the settlement. Someone burned those points before dawn. Selene turned from the ridge and moved back through the gates. They weren't burning them to announce themselves. They were burning them to remove anyone who might have reported their passage. Lisa was waiting at the inner courtyard, the fortress maps already spread across the stone table under the overhang. East and west passes both accessible? Selene asked. East is narrow, but passable until the hard freeze. Lisa pressed a finger to the parchment. West opens wider here, but adds 2 days of travel time. No one moving in force would take the west unless they didn't want to be tracked. Selene looked at the map. Vaelor would take the east, 40 riders, royal formation. They'd use the direct route because Vaelor doesn't hide. Maevra would take the west, Lisa said. Flat, clear. The two women looked at each other. Wake the full watch rotation, Selene said. I want eyes on both passes by the time that sun clears the ridge. And get Kaelin inside the east wing, now. Kaelin did not go easily. He was 6 years old and had his mother's stubbornness and a child's perfectly calibrated instinct for detecting when adults were trying to move him away from something important. He stood in the doorway of his room with his arms crossed and his silver eyes fixed on Selene with an expression that was in the worst possible way familiar to her. "Something's coming," he said, not a question. "Yes. I should be where I can see. You should be where I don't have to think about you while I'm working." She crouched to his level so the words landed directly. "I need my whole mind right now, Kay. I cannot do what needs doing if part of my mind is tracking where you are." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the high window and catching the silver in his eyes, and the gold under his wrist was a steady pulse that had been running faster since before dawn. One of the timber wolves had followed him from his room and now sat at his left side, enormous and patient, its muzzle at the boy's shoulder height. "The wolves want to go south," Kaelin said. "I know. They've been pulling at it since yesterday. I know that too. They're not scared." He said it carefully, the way he said things he was still working out. When they're scared, they get small and tight. These ones are doing the other thing, the big thing. Selene looked at her son and felt something move through her that had no clean name. Not fear, not quite pride. Something that lived in the territory between the two. The boy was right. The ancient wolf's response to whatever was approaching was not defensive. It was recognitional, and that was its own category of information she did not yet have time to process. "Inside," she said, "I will come to you the moment I have something to tell you. I swear it." He held her gaze a beat longer than a 6-year-old should have managed. Then he nodded, once, and stepped back from the doorway. She was halfway down the corridor when his voice came after her. "Mom." She stopped. "Don't let them take you either," he said. She did not turn around. She was afraid of what her face would do. "Lock the door," she said, and kept moving. Sham. The Eastern Pass riders came into sight at mid-morning. 40 horses, royal black with the iron banner of the Dravenheart line, moving in tight formation through the last descent of the mountain pass with the efficiency of men who had been riding hard for days and knew they were close. No torches in daylight, no herald advance. Vaelor Dravenheart did not announce himself with ceremony when he was not in a court setting. He announced himself with the sound of 40 war horses on stone and the very specific quality of silence that preceded him. Selene stood at the fortress wall and watched them come. She had put 12 of her best people on the wall with her. Not because 12 could stop 40 trained royal cavalry if it came to that. She was not delusional about the arithmetic. But because the wall sent a message. "You were expected. We are not running. Come in only on our terms." The formation halted 50 yards from the fortress gate. One rider separated from the group and came forward alone. Selene had not seen Vaelor Dravenheart in 6 years. He was larger than she remembered, or perhaps she had spent 6 years compressing her memory of him into something manageable, and the reality was always going to be an adjustment. He rode a black horse that moved like water, entirely unlike the formal parade animals of the palace. This was a war horse, trained in the specific mechanics of violence, and it responded to Vaelor's weight with the obedience of something that had been through difficult situations with its rider and trusted him for reasons that had nothing to do with gentleness. He pulled up 10 yards from the gate and looked up at her on the wall. 6 years. He looked harder than she remembered, the jaw heavier. The lines around his eyes had deepened in ways that had more to do with calculation than age. He wore no crown. He never wore crowns outside the court. Just his campaign gear, dark leather and iron, practical and expensive in equal measure. His eyes were the same, gold brown, sharp, the eyes of a man whose attention was the most dangerous thing about him. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her the way a man looked at an accounting that did not match. "You're not in Ashenfield," he said. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. "No?" she said. "The Ashenfield property has been empty since the month after I signed the decree." "Has it?" He let that sit between them without reacting to it. "You covered your route carefully. I didn't find the trail until the physician's report, and by then it was old." "You weren't looking very hard," she said. "You were busy," the smallest tightening around his eyes. She had landed that one flush, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, which was the particular grammar they had always spoken, everything important said underneath the actual words. "Open the gate, Selene." "No." A pause, long enough to have texture. "I'm not asking you to." "I know what you're doing," she said. The wall gave her height, and she used it, her voice coming down to him flat and clear, and without the performance of anger she did not feel. What she felt was colder than anger and more precise. "You're reclaiming. I understand how that works. You believe you've been deceived and something was taken from you, and you've come north to restore the correct order of things. I understand that completely." "Then open." "What you don't understand," she said, "is that there is no order here that belongs to you. You built no part of what is inside these walls. You funded nothing. You protected nothing. You have no ledger claim on anything beyond that gate." Vaelor's horse shifted and he settled it without looking down. His eyes stayed on her. "The child," he said. She held his gaze from the wall and did not blink. "My child," she said. Precisely. "Mine." "Selene." His voice had dropped. Not softer, lower, the register that meant the public performance was over and the actual conversation was beginning. "The physician's findings were confirmed by 3 independent sources. I know what Maevra's clan did. I know about the moonroot suppression. I know every assumption I made about you was built on what they fed me." "Good," she said. He waited. "That does not open the gate," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she had not seen on it before, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she did not entirely have a name for it. It was not rage. Vaelor's rage she knew thoroughly. It ran hot and fast and spent itself quickly. This was different. This was the look of a man who had arrived somewhere expecting a familiar terrain and found instead that the map he'd been using was wrong in ways he was still calculating. "I need to see him," Vaelor said. "What you need," Selene replied, "is not my primary concern." "Selene, you have riders on your east flank," she said. "I have eyes on the western pass." She watched his face for the reaction and caught it, a fractional tightening, barely there, enough to confirm what she suspected. "Whatever Maevra sent through the mountain passes before your dispatch left Kareth has already burned 6 points on the southern ridge. So you can argue property rights with me on this wall, or you can tell me what you know about her timeline, because right now that is the more pressing problem for both of us." Vaelor's jaw set. "How do you know about the western approach?" he asked. "Because I've been living in the shadow of these mountains for 6 years, and I know every road that touches them," she said. "How many did she send?" Another pause. This one shorter, the kind that meant he was revising his strategy in real time. "We don't know," he said. "We intercepted a courier 3 days out from Kareth. The message was already encoded. My cipher team is still working it." "How much of a lead did she have?" 4 days minimum, possibly 5. Selene looked south at the smoke still rising off the distant ridge. 4 days. Maevra's people had come through the western pass 4 days ago, and they had burned their trail behind them, and they were somewhere between the mountains and this wall right now, and the distance was not what it used to be. "Open the gate," Vaelor said again, and then after a beat that cost him something she could see even from the wall, "Please." She had not heard that word from him in 7 years. It had not been in his vocabulary where she was concerned. Everything between them had operated on assumption and authority and the implicit understanding that his preferences were the shape of the world, and she was expected to fill that shape gracefully. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Ren. "Open it," she said. "Just him. The riders stay outside the wall." He came into the fortress courtyard alone, which took something from him that she could see him not wanting to show. Vaelor operated in the grammar of force, he always had, and walking through a gate on someone else's terms with his cavalry standing outside in the cold was a fluency he did not have and had to fake. He dismounted. She came down from the wall. They stood in the courtyard in the gray winter light with 10 feet between them, and she looked at him steadily and waited because she had learned a long time ago that the first person to fill silence was the one who needed something. He looked around the courtyard, the fortress. The walls with her people on them, the layout of the inner yard, the training marks worn into the stone from years of regular use. "You've been running this place," he said. "Yes." "How many people?" "Enough." His eyes came back to her. "You built a defensible position." "I built a life," she said. Defensibility was a requirement, not a goal. He absorbed this. "The child is here." "Yes." You need to answer something for me first," she said, "before you go anywhere near him, before I let you within 50 feet of him." His jaw was working. He was a man who answered questions at his own discretion, and the reversal of that was visibly uncomfortable. But he was also a man who had ridden for days through mountain cold, and had arrived at a reality substantially different from what he'd expected, and she could see him making the calculation, what he was willing to accept in order to get what he'd come for. "Ask," he said. "When you signed the decree," she said, "did you believe it?" He looked at her directly. "Yes." "You believed I was barren." "I believed what the physicians said, what the council said. What years of—" "I'm not asking what you believe the evidence showed," she said. "I'm asking if you believed it, about me, that I was simply not enough, not capable, a failed investment." The courtyard was very quiet. "Yes," he said finally. The word came out with an edge to it, not because he was angry, but because it was the truth, and it had a shape that cut going out. She nodded. Once. She had already known. She was not asking to confirm the fact. She was asking to confirm that he would admit it, which was a different kind of information. "Then understand what I'm about to tell you," she said. "The child in this fortress is not yours to reclaim. He is not a political asset. He is not leverage against Maevra Voss. He is not a throne succession problem. He is a person, 6 years old, who has never been a failure or a disappointment to anyone in his life, and he does not know that is unusual. I have made sure of that. Do you understand what I'm saying? Selene, do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes." The word came out harder this time. Not resistance, something else, something that moved through him and was gone before she could fully read it. "I understand." She held his gaze for another beat. Then she turned toward the east wing. "Follow me," she said. "And if you do anything in the next 10 minutes that my instincts tell me to respond to, I will respond to it. Are we clear?" "We're clear," he said, and fell into step behind her, and for the first time in 6 years, Alpha King Vaelor Dravenheart followed someone else's lead without condition. Wosen. Kaelin was sitting on the floor of the east wing room when she opened the door, cross-legged in front of the fire with one of the timber wolves lying beside him, its massive head in his lap. He had a book open that he had not been reading. She could tell by the angle of it, the way he held it loose without tracking the lines. He had been listening, waiting. He looked up when the door opened, first at her, checking, the fast, specific check of a child who had learned to read adults as information systems. Then at the man behind her. Vaelor had gone still in the doorway. Selene watched him see his son for the first time. She had prepared herself for various versions of this moment over the years, in the way she prepared for most things, by thinking through the possible outcomes with enough regularity that none of them would blindside her. She had imagined denial, calculation, political response. She had imagined him looking at Kaelin and seeing an asset. She had imagined him looking and seeing an inconvenience. She had not quite imagined this. Vaelor's face did something that she had never seen it do in 7 years of marriage. It went still and soft and young, in a way that lasted only 2 or 3 seconds before his control reasserted itself. But those 2 seconds were the most honest thing she had ever seen from him. The gold-brown eyes went wide, and his breath changed, and the fundamental structure of his expression broke clean open and then closed again like a door catching in a draft. Kaelin looked at him. The timber wolf lifted its head from the boy's lap and regarded Vaelor with the calm, direct attention it gave to things it was measuring. "You're him," Kaelin said. Vaelor's voice, when he found it, was not what Selene expected. It was careful. "Who did you think I was?" "The king," Kaelin said. Simply. as though this were an ordinary identification of a thing in the room. Mom doesn't talk about you much, but Lysa does sometimes when she thinks I'm not listening. Lisa says you have eyes that don't miss things. A beat. She's right, Vaelor said. Kaelin studied him with those silver eyes, steady, without the performed wariness of a child who has been coached to be afraid. Selene had not coached him to be afraid. She had given him information about the world as he could handle it and trusted his own instincts to do the sorting. "Why are you here?" Kaelin asked. Vaelor glanced at Selene and she gave him nothing. This was his conversation to navigate. She had done her part. "I found out something was kept from me," Vaelor said. "Something important." "Me," Kaelin said. "Yes." "Were you looking?" The question landed in the room and sat there in the quiet, and Vaelor's jaw worked once, the same small tell she had seen in the courtyard. The timber wolf watched him without moving. "No," Vaelor said. "I wasn't looking." Kaelin considered this with his child's gravity. "Because you thought I didn't exist." "Because I thought—" He stopped, started again. "Because I was told a story that wasn't true, and I believed it without— I should have looked harder." "Why didn't you?" Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. "Because it was convenient to believe," he said finally, and Selene heard the specific cost of that sentence in the way the words came out. Not confessional, not performed, but flat and direct and true. Kaelin nodded slowly, as though this answered something he had been working on. "Lisa says convenient is what ruins kings," he said. Vaelor's breath came out once, short and involuntary. "Lysa," he said, with a note in his voice that in another man might have been mistaken for amusement, "is correct." The timber wolf settled its head back in the boy's lap. Kaelin looked at Vaelor, and there was something in the silver eyes that was doing what Selene recognized as the deep processing thing, the thing he did before he made a decision he intended to live with. "Are you going to take me away?" he asked. "Kaelin," Selene began. "He should answer," Kaelin said, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on Vaelor. "He knows." Vaelor looked at his son, then he looked at Selene, then he looked back at the boy on the floor with the wolf and the unread book. And whatever he saw in Kaelin's face, whatever the boy's gaze did to him in that moment, it reconfigured something in the set of his shoulders. "No," Vaelor said. "Not without your mother." It was not the answer Selene had anticipated. She did not let it show. Kaelin looked at him for another beat, making sure. "Okay," he said, and picked up his book. They were back in the courtyard when the watch horn sounded from the western wall. Single long blast. Contact on the western approach. Selene was moving before the echo died. Vaelor was a step behind her without being told, which told her something about how quickly he had recalibrated, because Vaelor Dravenheart did not fall into step behind people unless he had made a specific decision to trust the direction. She went up the western wall stairs and looked out at the tree line. Riders in the forest shadow. She couldn't count them yet. They were staying in cover deliberately, which was worse than an open approach because it meant they were positioning rather than advancing. Positioning meant they were waiting for something, for a signal, for a count, for a moment. "How many?" Vaelor said, coming up beside her. "Can't see yet. They're in the pines." Maeva's people would have a siege plan. She doesn't improvise. She'd have had 4 days to study the approach. Selene scanned the tree line, counting the shadows that moved wrong. She won't hit the walls directly, too costly. She'll try to cut the water supply first, then the eastern road to prevent your riders from flanking. Vaelor was doing his own counting. She could feel the shift in him, the way his body had changed register entirely, from whatever he had been managing in the East Wing room to this, the cold tactical machinery of a man who had spent 15 years in active military command. "You know siege methodology," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement. "I had 6 years in a good library," she said. "What's your water source?" "Cistern in the northeast tower, covered and accessible only from inside the wall." "They'll know that," he said. "Maeva uses insiders." She went cold. Not with surprise, with the specific cold of a calculation confirming itself. "Who on your dispatch?" "No one on my dispatch," he said, with the absolute certainty of a man who had personally vetted the people he brought into dangerous terrain. "But in Kareth, in the weeks before we left, someone in the palace knew where you were before I did." "How long has Maevra known about Kylan?" "Long enough to plan this." He looked out at the tree line. "Long enough to move first." Ren appeared at Selene's left shoulder. 30 riders in the tree line, maybe more behind them. They've got a siege ladder set up. I can see the profile of it against the pines. 30 to 40 outside. 40 of Vaelor's cavalry outside the eastern gate. "Your riders," Selene said. "Can they flank around the north wall in time?" Vaelor's eyes were already tracking the approach geometry. "If they move now, and fast. But that leaves your eastern gate undefended for 12 minutes. 12 minutes is a long time." "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was no time for the full weight of what this moment required. No time for the accounting of 6 years, for the conversation that neither of them had finished in the courtyard, for the question of what came after this, or whether there was an after this. There was only the 30 riders in the tree line, and the 12 minutes, and the boy in the east wing with the gold light moving under his wrist. "Send your riders north," she said. "I'll hold the eastern gate." "Selene, I know these walls and you don't," she said. "That's not sentiment, that's math. Send your riders." He looked at her for 2 full seconds. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the rapid internal calculation she recognized from the years she had spent watching him manage impossible choices. The flash of something that in another man would be argument or override, and the particular moment when Vaelor Dravenheart decided not to be that man. "I'll go with the cavalry," he said. "I need to be at the north flank when contact is made." "Go." He moved toward the stairs. Stopped. "If they breach before we—" "They won't." "If they do—" "Vaelor!" She said his name for the first time since he'd arrived, and the shape of it stopped him where the warnings hadn't. "Get your riders moving." He was gone down the stairs and through the courtyard in seconds, and she heard the eastern gate open and the thunder of 40 cavalry horses moving fast around the wall's northern edge. 12 minutes. She turned to Ren. "Get everyone on the eastern wall. I want archers on the gate tower and the 2 flanking positions. Anything that moves toward that gate in the next quarter hour?" The tree line erupted. Not 30 riders. More than 70. They came out of the pines fast and low and without the siege ladder, which meant the siege ladder had been a decoy. Something positioned to be visible, to be counted, to be reported and factored into a defense plan that Maevra had already predicted they would build. The real force had been in the deeper forest, hidden, waiting for exactly this moment. The moment when Vaelor's cavalry moved around the north wall and the eastern gate was held by fortress defenders alone. Selene looked at the wave of riders coming across the open ground toward the gate she had 12 minutes to hold, and she felt her mind go clean and cold and completely clear, the way it went when every option simplified itself into one. She put her hand on the wall and leaned out and shouted down to the yard. "Get Kalen to the cistern passage. Now. Move him now." And then she picked up the bow from the wall rack beside her and drew, and the first arrow was already in the air before the lead rider had covered half the distance to the gate. The eastern gate held for 9 minutes. On the 10th minute, something happened that Selene had not planned for and could not have. From inside the fortress, from the direction of the northeast tower where Lysa had taken Kalen when the alarm sounded, a sound rose that Selene had no frame for. Not a horn, not a voice, not anything she had ever heard come from a human throat or a wolf's mouth. It was all of those things at once, and underneath it ran a frequency that she felt in her teeth and her sternum and the marrow of her legs. The attacking riders' horses stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Every animal in the assault line locked its legs and refused to move, throwing riders forward and sideways, the front line collapsing into a chaos of screaming horses and dismounted fighters struggling to find their feet in the frozen ground. And over the wall and across the frozen field, Selene heard the ancient wolves begin to howl in unison. Not the warning sound, not the territorial sound, but the other sound Ren had described, the big one. The sound that had no name because the people who remembered what it meant were 4 centuries dead. She turned from the gate. Below in the courtyard, lit by the pale winter sun, a small figure stood at the base of the northeast tower stairs. Kaelin. 6 years old, standing completely still in the frozen yard, his arms loose at his sides and his silver eyes open wide, and the golden light under his skin not a pulse anymore, but a steady burn that threw actual light across the stone around him. The timber wolves were at his left and right, sitting tall. Every guard on the wall had gone quiet. And through the eastern gate, she could hear the sounds of Vaelor's cavalry arriving from the north flank into the chaos of 70 stopped horses and thrown riders, rolling through the assault force like water through a broken dam. Selene walked down the stairs into the courtyard, crossed to her son, and crouched in front of him. His eyes came to her, focused, completely present. "I told them to stop," he said. His voice was perfectly ordinary. The voice of a 6-year-old explaining something he had worked out for himself. "The horses. They were confused," he said. "They didn't want to be doing what they were being made to do, so I told them they could stop." She looked at him for a long moment. The gold light under his wrist was warm against her hand where she touched it. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm tired," he said. "Okay." She pulled him in against her, feeling the warmth of the light even through the fabric of his clothes, and she held him there in the courtyard, with the sound of Vaelor's cavalry working through the assault force beyond the walls. "Okay, that's done now. You're done." He put his head against her shoulder. "He's not bad," Kaelin said quietly. She knew who he meant. "No," she said carefully. "He's complicated." "I know the difference between bad and complicated," her son said. "You taught me." She pressed her lips to the top of his head and did not answer that, because he was right, and the weight of that, the weight of what this morning had remade and what it could not unmake, and what the man beyond the walls was going to have to become before she could trust the shape of it, settled into her chest like the beginning of something very long that neither of them were prepared for. The eastern gate opened. Vaelor Dravenheart walked through it on foot, his horse left behind, his campaign gear marked with the morning's fighting. He walked into the courtyard and stopped at the sight of his son standing in the circle of golden light with Selene's arms around him. He looked at the boy. The boy looked up at him over Selene's shoulder. "You need to see something," Vaelor said. His voice was completely level. The level that meant something difficult was coming. "We took a prisoner in the assault line, one of Maevra's officers. He was carrying encoded documents." He paused. "My cipher team cracked the last section of the original courier message on the road north." Selene stood, her arms stayed at her sides. "What does it say?" Vaelor looked at her. "Maevra's been moving pieces for 3 years," he said. "This wasn't a response to what the physician found. She had this planned before I signed the decree. She already knew about the pregnancy, Selene. She has had people inside this fortress." The courtyard went very quiet. "Inside this fortress," Selene repeated, "at least one person, maybe more. The message references a source inside the Frostfang position as a point of confirmation that the asset was still viable." His eyes were on her face, hard and direct. "Someone inside these walls has been reporting to Maevra." Selene looked at the people on the walls, at the faces she had built 6 years of trust with, at the people who had kept her son alive and hidden and safe. Lysa, Ren, Dort, the watch rotations, the guards she had trained and fed and organized. Someone in that number, she felt it move through her, not panic, not grief, not even anger yet. Just the cold, specific sensation of a foundation developing a fracture. The way stone felt before it gave. The deep, resonant wrongness of a structure that had been reliable and was suddenly not. "Then she already knows everything she needs to know," Selene said. "Yes," Vaelor said, "which means what she sent today wasn't her main force." She looked at him. "It was a scouting action," he said. "She sent enough to test the defense, gather confirmation of the boy's existence and capabilities, and retreat enough survivors to report back." He met her eyes. "She'll come with everything next time, and she'll come prepared for what Kaelin can do." Selene stood in the courtyard of the fortress she had built out of the wreckage of her exile, with her son at her side and the enemy already inside her walls in a form she could not yet identify, and the man she had once been married to standing in her gate with information that confirmed the worst possible shape of the situation, and she understood with complete clarity that there was no position to defend anymore. There was only forward. "How fast can your cavalry move?" she asked. "Fast. We're not holding this fortress," she said. "We need to move toward the capital before Maevra can consolidate her position there. If we stay here, we're contained and she controls the terms." Vaelor's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're talking about marching on Kareth." "I'm talking about not giving Maevra the luxury of choosing the ground," she said, "with a 6-year-old child." "With the Golden Heir," she said. "Which is not the same thing. You saw what he did to 70 war horses from a tower stairway." Vaelor looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked back at him with those silver eyes, tired but steady. "The capital is 3 weeks of hard travel in winter conditions," Vaelor said. "Then we'd better leave before dark," Selene said. She turned toward the fortress interior. She had to find out who in her walls had been feeding information to Maevra Voss. She had 3 hours to do it before they had to move, and she would not leave a traitor behind her when she went. 3 hours. Selene gave herself 3 hours to find a traitor among 61 people she had chosen, fed, trained, and trusted with her son's existence. She started with what she knew. The encoded message Vaelor's cipher team had cracked referenced a source inside the Frostfang position with enough operational specificity to confirm it was not a guess or an inference. Maevra's officer had been carrying language that described the fortress layout, the cistern in the northeast tower, the watch rotation schedule, the number of people on the wall at any given hour. That level of detail required either prolonged access or a single source positioned centrally enough to observe everything. Not a guard. Guards saw walls and yards and the rotation they were assigned to. The person Maevra had inside the fortress saw the whole picture. Selene stood in Lysa's kitchen with the older woman across the table and laid this out without softening it, the way she laid out everything that required clear thinking. Lysa listened. Her face did not move much. It never did. "The rotation schedule," Lysa said when Selene finished. "Yes. I write the rotation schedule. I know." A long silence. The fire in the kitchen grate popped once. "You're not accusing me," Lysa said. "No," Selene said. "I'm telling you what the evidence points to so that the two of us can figure out who else had access to that document." Lysa's shoulders came down a fraction. The release of a person who had been bracing for something that did not land. Then her jaw set in the way it did when she was moving from emotion back into function, which was the thing Selene had always respected about her. "The rotation schedule is kept in the records room," Lysa said. "I write it, I post it, and it sits in the records book at the end of each week. Who goes into the records room? Me. You. Ren for the watch confirmations." Lysa paused. "Dort." Selene was very still. "Dort comes in on the first day of each month for the supply accounts," Lysa said carefully. "She cross-references the watch rotations against the provision numbers so we don't overorder for off-duty personnel." Selene thought about Dort, about a woman who had been in the room the night Kaelin was born, who had seen the gold light under his wrist, who had a daughter in the Greyvass settlements, indentured to a mill. She thought about the terms of that arrangement, the promise she had made, the daughter she had freed. Then she thought about what Maevra Voss could offer that was more durable than a single debt repaid. What a woman with the ear of the war clans and access to empire-level resources could place in front of someone who had seen something extraordinary and understood its value and had no protection of their own. "Where is Dort right now?" she asked. Lysa was already moving. They found her in the south storage passage, which connected to the rear postern gate through a corridor that Selene had always considered a secondary vulnerability and had meant to address and had not gotten around to. Dort was moving fast through the corridor with a travel sack, and when the lamplight found her, she stopped and went very still in the way of a person who has been caught at something they knew they were risking. She was a compact woman, 50 years old, with a midwife's steady hands and a face that had spent a long time learning to be unreadable. She was reading readable now. The lamplight caught the sweat on her upper lip and the particular set of her eyes. Not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. Something harder and more practical. A person who had made a calculation and was still standing behind it even now that it had been interrupted. How long? Selene asked. Dort looked at her. She did not try to talk her way out of it, which was either dignity or practicality, probably both. 4 years, she said. Selene felt the number hit her like cold water to the face. 4 years. Kaelin had been 2 years old. She had spent 4 years sleeping under a roof with a person feeding information to Maevra Voss. And she had not known, and the not knowing had a specific physical sensation. Not shame, but something adjacent to it. The sensation of a foundation that had held weight for years and been quietly hollowing out from below. Your daughter, Selene said. Her contract got extended, Dort said. 3 years in, they extended it. They said she'd violated a provision in the original indenture and the debt doubled. Her voice was flat and factual. Maevra's people came to me. They said they could have her out in a month and set up somewhere Clan Voss couldn't touch her. All they wanted was information, nothing that would put the boy in immediate danger, they said. Just location confirmations, visitor counts, watch schedules. Just information, Selene said. I know how it sounds. I don't think you do, Selene said. I think you know what it was and you're using the softest words available for it. Dort looked at the floor, then back up. Is she out? She asked. My daughter. The question cost her something to ask. Selene could see it. I don't know, Selene said, honestly. Whether Maevra kept that promise depends entirely on what your daughter is worth to her, now that this is over. What happens to me? Dort asked. Selene looked at her for a long moment. You walk out the postern gate you were heading for, she said. Take your sack. Take whatever food is in it. And you understand that you cannot come back, and that the protection of these walls no longer exists for you, and that what you chose has consequences that belong to you and not to the child you sold information about. Dort looked at her. Something moved across her face. Not relief, not quite. Something more complicated than relief. The expression of a person receiving a verdict they know is more merciful than they earned. I'm sorry, Dort said. I know, Selene said. Go. Dort went. Her footsteps moved down the corridor, and the postern gate opened and closed, and the sound of it had a finality that Selene stood inside for a moment without moving. 4 years. She turned to Lisa, who had been standing behind her in the corridor. We leave before dark. What Dort couldn't report tonight, she'll find another way to get to Maevra's people by morning. The march preparation. 2 hours, Selene said. Whatever we can pack in 2 hours, the rest stays. She walked back toward the main fortress, and she was already rebuilding the timeline in her head, already recalculating what Maevra now knew and what she would do with it, already moving forward because standing still in the wreckage of something was a luxury she had never been able to afford and was not going to start affording now. Vaelor found her in the East Wing collecting Kaelin's things. Not much, the same philosophy she had applied to her own departure from the palace 6 years ago. And for a moment, he stood in the doorway watching her pack with the wordless efficiency of a woman who had done this before. You found the source, he said. Dealt with. Who? Someone who had a reason and no better options and made a choice that I can understand and that cannot be excused. She folded a small blanket and set it in the pack. It doesn't matter who now. What matters is that Maevra has 4 years of detailed intelligence on this fortress, on Kaelin's development, on what he can do. Vaelor was quiet for a moment. She'll be prepared for him. She's been preparing for him since he was 2 years old. Selene straightened, which means everything I've been doing here, the walls, the watches, the careful containment of information, she already accounted for all of it. That's not what this is, he said. She looked at him. You kept him alive, Vaelor said. For 6 years, with one embedded source feeding against you, you kept him alive and undetected by every official channel. That isn't a failure of the containment. That's the containment working despite a hole in it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're trying to be useful, she said. Yes. Don't manage me, she said. Give me information or tactical support. Don't manage me. His jaw tightened once, then released. Understood. She picked up the pack. Is your cavalry ready? Ready and resupplied from your stores. Your quartermaster. Lysa. Lysa is impressive, he said, with the specific tone of a military man acknowledging a logistics capability that had surprised him. She had the resupply organized in 40 minutes. I know, Selene said. I trained her to. She moved past him out of the room and did not look back at it, because looking back at things was how you lost time you didn't have. They left the fortress in the last light of the afternoon, moving northeast toward the lower Frostfang passes that would bring them eventually to the road south toward Kareth. Vaelor's 40 cavalry formed a perimeter around the group, 12 of Selene's fortress people who had chosen to come, Lysa and Ren among them, and Kaelin on a mountain pony that the boy rode with the self-possessed calm he brought to most things physical. The timber wolves followed at the edge of the tree line, visible in the spaces between the pines, moving parallel without closing the distance. They had not been asked. They simply came. The first day of travel was hard going. The mountain passes were cold and narrow, and the footing was uncertain in the early dark, and they moved by torchlight through terrain that required attention rather than speed. Selene rode near the middle of the column with Kaelin, where she could see both ends of the formation, and she watched the shadows between the trees and thought about the road ahead. 3 weeks to Kareth in winter, longer if conditions turned. Maevra would have had a courier on the way to the capital before the assault force had finished retreating. She was not a woman who waited for confirmation before executing the next stage of a plan. By the time Selene's group reached the lowland roads, Maevra would already be managing the palace response. You're calculating, Kaelin said from beside her. She glanced at him. He was watching the path ahead, easy in the saddle, the pony moving steadily beneath him. Yes, she said. You get a specific kind of quiet when you're doing it. He thought for a moment. Like the fire going low. Still there but turned down. She looked at her son for a beat. When did you start noticing that? A long time ago, he said, in the manner of a child who considered 2 or 3 years a long time. Which it was when you were 6. She turned back to the path. What I'm calculating is time, how much of it we have and what it buys us. Against Maevra. Yes. He was quiet for a stretch of trail. Is she smart? He asked. Very. Smarter than you? Selene considered this honestly. She's been playing a longer game than me for longer. She had resources I didn't. She had access to the palace and the clans in Vaelor's ear. She paused. But she's been playing one game. I've been surviving several simultaneously. Kaelin nodded as though this were a satisfying distinction. Ren says surviving harder makes you sharper, he said. Ren's right. Ren's right about most things, he agreed. From ahead in the column, she heard Vaelor's voice issuing a quiet instruction to one of his cavalry officers, and she noticed, without letting herself react to the noticing, that in the hours since they'd left the fortress, the man had not once contradicted her organizational decisions, had not once positioned himself as the operational authority over the group. He had integrated into the column's existing structure as though he understood something about why that mattered that he would not have understood 6 years ago. She was not going to read too much into it, but she noted it. On the third night, they made camp in a shallow valley below the last of the high passes, where the trees were thick enough to break the wind and a frozen stream bed provided level ground. Vaelor's people were disciplined campers, fires built low and covered, no unnecessary noise, watches rotated in 4-hour intervals. Selene's people integrated into the watch rotation without friction, which told her something about how Lysa had briefed them before departure. She sat apart from the main campfire, going through the encoded documents that Vaelor had passed to her at the fortress. His cipher team had done good work. The translation was clean, and she had been reading it in every spare moment of the march, building the picture of what Maevra had actually constructed over the past 7 years. It was extensive. It was, in its way, impressive. The same way a storm was impressive, powerful and without conscience, and enormously destructive and built entirely from elements that had been in motion long before anyone noticed the pattern. Vaelor sat down across from her without being invited, which she had expected. He had been tracking her with his eyes for hours, the slow, patient tracking of a man who had something to say and was choosing his moment. She did not look up from the documents. Say it. The Voss clan has been feeding the border lords, he said. The encoded message. There are references to payments to 3 separate territorial lords between here and the capital. They're not just allied with Maevra, they're contractually bound to her. I read it. Which means the road south isn't clean. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice lowered below the camp sounds. We can't move openly through Voss-allied territories with 40 riders and a recognizable column. Someone will send word ahead. We move at night through the Crestfall stretch and avoid the main road from Drevith to the capital junction, she said, still reading. The old trade route through the Ashgate Valley is longer, but it bypasses all 3 of the lords you're looking at. A pause. You mapped alternate routes, he said. 3 years ago, she said. When I understood that if we ever had to leave quickly, leaving slowly would get us killed. He was quiet for a moment. Selene. She looked up. I am trying to... He stopped. His jaw worked once. The expression on his face was one she had not catalogued before from him. The expression of a man who had a great deal of practice saying things that sounded like what needed to be said, and was right now attempting to say something that was actually true, and finding the 2 skills were not the same. I know what you're trying to do, she said, not unkindly. You're trying to figure out how to be useful in a situation where you have more power than me in most categories that count, and none of it has been relevant yet. That's uncomfortable. He looked at her directly. That is a specific and accurate assessment. I've had a long time to think clearly about you, she said. Not bitterly, just clearly. What did you conclude? She set down the documents. That you are a better king than you are a person, she said, and that those 2 things have been in each other's way for as long as I've known you. The king in you is capable of exceptional things. The person in you was willing to look at a woman he'd been beside for 7 years and accept a story about her body without asking her directly once. He received this without defending against it. That was new. The Vaelor she had known would have deflected or redirected or moved the conversation to ground where he had better footing. This one sat with it. What do you need from me on this march? He asked. Military coordination and your cavalry's capability, she said. That's real, and I need it. And personally? She picked up the documents again. Don't ask me to want things from you that I'm not certain I want yet. Let the march be what it is. He was quiet for a long moment. That's fair, he said. I know, she said. He rose, moved back toward the main campfire, and she watched him go in her peripheral vision and then looked back at the encoded documents and sat with the complicated truth that clarity about a person and certainty about what to do with them were not the same achievement, and that she had only ever managed to reach the first one. On the 6th day, they came down out of the mountains onto the lowland roads, and the world opened up from mountain cold and narrow passes into the gray winter flatlands of the Empire's northern territories, fields and frozen streams, and the distant smudge of settlements that had been paying taxes to the Iron Throne for 3 generations. And on the 6th night, the trap closed. They came through a narrow defile between 2 rock formations, a feature that the maps called the Crestfall Gap, on the alternate route that Selene had identified 3 years ago as the safer passage through the Voss-allied territories, the route that bypassed the 3 lords, the route that Dort had not been in the records room for, had not had access to, could not have reported, the route Selene had told Vaelor about on the 3rd night of the march. Vaelor. She understood it the same instant the first torch appeared on the rock above them. Not Vaelor himself, not someone he had ordered, but one of the 40 riders, one of the royal cavalry he had personally vetted and brought north on a mission he had believed was secure, and who had been feeding information on an entirely different channel for an entirely different purpose, and had heard the alternate route discussed in a camp on the 3rd night and had passed it along. The torches multiplied. Both high walls of the defile lit up simultaneously, and the sound of horses on the rock above them was dense and organized. Not scouts, a full force, positioned before they arrived and waiting. Maevra's people did not announce themselves with words. The first arrows came down from the upper walls in a sweeping arc, and the column broke apart the way trained cavalry broke under unexpected fire, outward and fast, riders peeling to the sides looking for cover that the defile's narrow walls did not provide. Selene had Kaelin off his pony and against the rock wall in 3 seconds. Her body between him and the defile opening, her knife in her hand, screaming at the column to break south and reform. Vaelor's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere ahead in the dark, issuing rapid tactical commands to his cavalry, and she could hear his people responding, training asserting itself through the shock of ambush, the formation beginning to cohere even in the narrow space. But the defile was the problem. It was a killing ground, and they were standing inside it. "Move south," she shouted. "Out of the defile, move south!" An arrow took the rock face 3 inches from her left shoulder, and she felt the chip of stone cut her cheek and kept moving, pulling Kaelin with her, his hand in hers, running south along the wall toward the defile's exit. Ren appeared out of the dark at her right side, short blade drawn, tracking the wall above them. "How many?" Selene said. "Too many to fight in this space," Ren said. "They knew our route." "I know they knew." They made the southern exit of the defile with 8 of Vaelor's cavalry forming a rear guard around them, and the rest of the column collapsing through the gap and reforming in the open ground south of the rocks. Selene counted, 4 riders down in the defile. 2 of her fortress people she could not account for in the dark and chaos. Vaelor came through the defile last, on foot, with 2 of his cavalry holding the entrance long enough for the rear elements to clear. He came out with blood on his arm from a cut that had gone through the leather at the forearm and was not shallow, and he ignored it with the practiced disregard of a man who had sustained worse and kept working. He found her in the dark, and his eyes went immediately to Kaelin, who was standing beside her, breathing hard, unhurt. Then they looked at each other. "Someone in your cavalry, Gist," she said. His face went through something that she had no word for. Something that started as denial and moved through it too fast to stop at it, and came out the other side as a particular kind of cold that she recognized because she had felt it herself in the south storage corridor when Dort had said 4 years. "I vetted those riders personally," he said. "I know you did. I have known some of those people for—" "I know," she said. "It doesn't change what it is." He looked at the riders around them. 40 had gone in. 34 had come out. 4 of the 6 unaccounted for were bodies in the defile. The other 2 were somewhere in his cavalry, and one of them had heard a conversation in a camp on the 3rd night and passed the route to Maevra's network. She watched him understand that he could not identify which 2. She watched him understand what that meant for the rest of the march. "I can't trust my own column," he said. "No," she said. "Not completely." The word was almost inaudible. Not volume. It was something deeper than volume. The sound a structure made in the moment before it acknowledged it was going to have to be rebuilt from different materials. Kaelin was watching his father from her side, silver eyes tracking the expression on Vaelor's face with the same careful attention he gave to things he was trying to understand. "What do we do?" Kaelin asked. Vaelor looked at his son, and Selene watched something happen to the Alpha King's face that she had been watching for the shape of since the courtyard in the fortress. The thing that arrived when a man who had built his entire identity on the power of certainty ran out of things he was certain of. It was not collapse, it was not defeat, it was the specific expression of a person being forced by circumstances to become someone their habits had never allowed them to be. The terrifying, necessary, fundamental reshaping of a thing that had believed its own form was permanent. "We move on foot through the back country," Vaelor said. "Smaller group. No horses on the main roads. I'll send the full cavalry ahead as a visible decoy. They'll draw Maevra's attention toward the main roads while we move under it." Selene looked at him. "You'll split your military protection." "Yes." "If Maevra's people identify the decoy, she'll commit force to it anyway," he said, "because she can't afford not to. She doesn't know which column has Kaelin. We make them both look real, and we move in the gap. That leaves us with a smaller group and no military guarantee." "Yes," he said. "It does." She studied him for a moment. The cut on his arm was still bleeding through the leather, and he had not once looked at it. "You understand that if we do this," she said carefully, "you are walking into the capital of your own empire with 12 people and no official force, on the assumption that arriving at all will be enough to shift the political balance. I'm not arriving as a king reclaiming his throne, he said. I'm arriving as a father protecting his son. Those are different. He held her gaze. The Empire knows me as one thing. Let it see something it hasn't seen before. Let them see a man who chose the harder direction when the easier one would have cost him nothing. The night was cold around them. The timber wolves had emerged from the tree line south of the defile, massive and pale in the dark, circling the group at a distance. Kaelin moved just slightly, and Selene felt his hand find hers. She looked down at him. The gold pulse under his wrist was steady as ever, and his silver eyes were on his father, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen from him before. Careful, measuring, a child doing the work of deciding whether a person had earned the beginning of trust. Vaelor looked at his son's hand in Selene's, and something moved through him that he did not try to manage or redirect. 3 weeks was the original estimate, she said. We do this on foot through back country. It's longer. However long it takes, he said. And then, I am not leaving you behind this time. I understand if that doesn't mean what I need it to mean yet. But I am telling you, I will not make that choice again. She held his gaze for a long beat. Don't tell me, she said. Show me the road. He turned. He started walking. Selene fell into step with Kaelin at her side, and the 12 people of their remaining group moved into the dark behind them, and the timber wolves closed in from the tree line, flanking the column left and right in the cold night. And somewhere far south through the frozen countryside, the capital of Varelion was waiting for a king to return to it. Not the kind of king it had made, but the kind of king who is only made by losing everything he thought was power, and discovering what remains when the loss is complete. None of them knew yet that Maevra had stopped waiting for reports. She had already moved her war clan forces into the capital 3 days ago, and she had already sent word to every noble house in the Empire that Alpha King Vaelor Dravenheart had abandoned his throne, his army, and his empire to chase a barren exile into the northern mountains, and that the Empire deserved a ruler who understood that the Iron Throne was not a gift to be neglected, but a charge to be held by those strong enough to hold it. The letters had already reached 30 houses. 22 of them had already sent back their seals of acknowledgement. Varelion was not waiting for Vaelor to come home. Varelion was already being told that home no longer belonged to him. The letters had reached 30 houses. Vaelor learned this on the 9th day of the backcountry march, from a settlement trader who recognized him anyway, despite the stripped insignia, despite the campaign beard, and the road dirt, and the fact that he was traveling with 12 people and no banner, and who delivered the news with the careful neutrality of a man who was not certain yet which way the wind was finally going to blow and had no intention of committing until it did. 22 seals of acknowledgement, 22 houses that had looked at Maevra's letter and decided that a queen in possession of the capital was worth more than a king on a mountain road. Vaelor stood in the trader's yard in the gray morning and received this information without expression, which was the skill he had spent 30 years building, the ability to absorb a catastrophic fact without letting it travel from his mind to his face. He thanked the trader. He paid for the supplies they needed. He walked back to where Selene was breaking camp with the others, and he told her what he had learned, and he watched her take it the same way he had, straight and without softening. 22, she said. Out of 30 contacted. Possibly more by now. She looked at the cold sky. Which 8 didn't respond? The trader didn't know all the names. He caught the story from a courier passing through. Vaelor crouched and began rolling his own betting because there was no one to do it for him, and he had, over 9 days of backcountry travel, gotten efficient at doing things for himself that he had not done since before his first command. House Dreven was mentioned as one of the holdouts. Lord Castle's name came up as uncertain. Castle is cautious, not loyal, Selene said. He'll wait to see which direction has momentum before he commits. Then we need to create momentum before he decides. She looked at him. We have 12 people and no cavalry, and we're 11 days from the capital. 10, he said. If we cut through the Ashgate Valley properly and move at night through the Drevith stretch. 10 days against a woman who has been sitting in the capital for 11 days already, building her position with clan resources and 22 noble seals. She kept her voice even. Not despair. Inventory. The difference mattered, and she knew it. What does she have militarily? Clan Voss maintains a war force of roughly 800 active soldiers, he said. She'll have pulled them all, plus whatever she could conscript from the allied noble houses. Possibly 1,200 total inside Kareth. What's left of your loyal forces? The 40 cavalry I sent as decoy, assuming they haven't been intercepted. Whatever remained garrisoned at the capital when I left, which Maevra will have either turned or confined. He paused. The eastern border legions haven't been contacted yet. If we can get word to Commander Veth before Maevra's messengers reach him, he might move. Might, she said. Veth served under my father, and he has no love for the Voss clan. It's the strongest might I have. How do we reach him without Maevra's network intercepting the message? Vaelor was quiet for a moment. Selene looked at him. The cipher my father used, he said. Veth would know it. It predates every system Maevra's people could have access to. Do you remember it? Every character, he said. My father made me write it from memory every month for 4 years. I hated him for it at the time. Write the message tonight, she said. We'll find a rider in the next settlement who's going east. She moved to finish breaking camp, and Vaelor watched her for a moment. The efficient economy of her movements, the way she organized the group's departure without theater, the way every decision she made was 3 steps ahead of the current moment, and he thought about the 7 years they had spent in the same palace while he had been building an empire, and she had been building something he hadn't had the vision to recognize as infrastructure. He thought about what infrastructure built in silence was worth, and what it had cost her to build it, and whether the accounting he owed for that could be paid in anything other than the rest of his life. Then he picked up his pack and fell into the march. They moved through the back country for 3 more days before the first sign came that Maevra knew where they were. It came in the form of a burning farmstead on the eastern edge of the Ashgate Valley. Not old burning, recent, the smoke still black and chemical-smelling rather than the gray of settled ash. The buildings had been put down deliberately, not by accident, and the timing was not coincidental. Someone in Maevra's network had triangulated their route from the Crestfall ambush and was burning a line of reference points behind them to narrow the approach corridors. Selene stood at the edge of the farmstead and looked at the pattern of the burning. 3 structures, the main building, the grain store, and the northern stable. But not the southern outbuilding, which had a clear sightline to the road they were on. The one building left standing was the one useful for observation. She's not trying to stop us, Selene said. Ren was beside her. No. She's marking us, keeping us visible to her network. And pushing us toward the main road, Ren said. Each burn point closes off another back route. We're being herded. Selene turned to Vaelor, who had read the same pattern from a different angle and was standing with the look on his face of a man confirming a calculation he had hoped was wrong. She wants us to arrive, he said. She wants us to arrive on her terms, Selene said, into whatever she's prepared at the capital. Then we don't take the road she's closed. He looked at the map, the physical one, worn at the folds from 10 days of constant consultation. There's a river crossing at Fen's Reach, not on any official route. Local fishermen use it. Adds a day, but it bypasses everything between here and the south gate of Kareth. Do you know it? I hunted this region for 2 years before my father died, he said. I know it. She looked at him and made the decision quickly because slow decisions in herded terrain were the kind that got you killed. Lead. He led. Damned. The Fen's Reach crossing was a flat-bottom ford over a river that ran fast and very cold, chest deep at the center and wider than it looked from the bank. They crossed it in the last hour of daylight, each person moving through the current with the specific focused attention of someone who understood that the cold water was a secondary problem and the footing was the primary one. Vaelor went first and came back and went again, guiding the group through in pairs, his hand a fixed point in the current that each person reached for in the deepest stretch. When Kaelin's turn came, the boy walked into the water without hesitation, and the cold hit him and his jaw set against it, and he moved through the current with his eyes forward, not looking down. Vaelor's hand found his arm at the deep point and held it without ceremony. Kaelin looked at him briefly and then looked forward again and kept moving. On the far bank, they wrung out what they could and kept walking because stopping meant the cold deepened faster, and Selene moved through the group, checking each person the way she had always done, Not mothering, assessing, the systematic inventory of a woman who understood that a group's capability was only as reliable as its weakest current state. That night they camped without fire, which was its own particular misery in the cold. But Selene had made the call and everyone accepted it because a fire in that terrain was a signal to Maevra's network that was not worth the warmth. She sat against a tree in the dark with Kaelin pressed against her side for body heat, both of them wrapped in the same heavy blanket, and she listened to the night sounds and thought about what waited ahead. The capital, 1,200 soldiers holding it for a woman who had spent 7 years building toward this moment. 22 noble houses already committed. A throne room that had once been the architecture of Selene's daily humiliation, that she had walked through for 7 years as something decorative and insufficient, that she was now approaching with a 6-year-old boy who made war horses stop in their tracks, and a man she had not forgiven and did not know yet if she would. "You're doing the fire thing again," Kaelin said quietly. "Yes? Are you afraid?" She considered giving him the comfortable answer, decided against it. "Yes," she said. "Not of what happens to me, of what could happen to you." He was quiet for a moment. The timber wolves were out in the dark somewhere, and she could feel them the way she had learned to feel them over 6 years. Not hear, not see, but register, the way you registered a change in air pressure before weather arrived. "I'm not afraid," Kaelin said. "I know. Is that bad?" "It depends on why," she said. "Are you not afraid because you don't understand the danger, or because you understand it and have decided it doesn't change what you're going to do?" He thought about this seriously. "The second one," he said. She pulled him closer. "Then no," she said. "It's not bad." They reached the outer edges of the Kareth territory on the 12th day. The capital was visible from the high road approach as a smudge of smoke and torchlight against the winter sky, the Iron Throne's towers catching the last light in the way Selene had always found beautiful and was not finding beautiful now. The south gate was closed and guarded. She could see the additional fortification from a distance, the doubled watch positions, the Clan Voss banners that had been raised on the gate towers alongside the Imperial standard. Not instead of it, alongside it. Maevra was not declaring herself outright. She was installing herself by increments, which was the method she had always used, and was the most dangerous kind because it gave every outside house a reason to wait and see rather than act, and waiting and seeing was the slow death of opposition. "She hasn't declared herself queen," Vaelor said, beside her, reading the same banners. "She won't until she has to," Selene said. "Every day she manages without declaring, she buys more acquiescence from the houses that haven't committed yet. She needs me confirmed dead or deposed before she can move openly. Which is why she's been herding us toward the capital instead of trying to stop us on the road." Selene looked at the gate. "She wants a public confrontation, something visible, something that ends with you either eliminated or discredited in a way the court witnesses directly." "Then we give her a public confrontation," Vaelor said, "just not the kind she planned for." He turned to the group. 12 people. Selene, Kaelin, Ren, Lysa, 7 of his cavalry who had survived the Crestfall ambush and had been vetted as clean in the brutal efficiency of the days that followed. Vaelor had done it himself, the grim arithmetic of process of elimination, and the 2 people who had not cleared that process were no longer with them. 2 of Selene's fortress people whose names she knew well. 12 people to walk into a capital held by 1,200. "The east postern," Vaelor said. "It's a maintenance gate on the river wall. The guard there rotates on a 4-hour cycle, and the position isn't reinforced during the middle rotation because it's considered low-value access." "How do you know Maevra hasn't changed the rotation?" Selene asked. "I don't," he said. "But the Voss clan didn't build those walls, and they've had 11 days to learn them. 11 days is enough to learn the main approaches. It's not enough to learn every detail of the riverside. And if the postern is reinforced? We find another way." His voice was even. "We don't stop." She looked at him for a beat, then nodded. They moved. "Dad." The postern gate was not reinforced. It was guarded by 2 Voss soldiers who were cold and bored and not expecting company from the riverside in the deep of a winter night, and Vaelor's cavalry handled it with a speed and silence that Selene did not watch closely and did not have time to feel complicated about. They moved through the river gate into the lower city. Kareth at night was not the sleeping city she remembered. There were Voss clan soldiers on the main streets in pairs, and the ordinary night traffic of the capital. The tavern sounds, the watch patrols, the easy movement of a city that knew its own rhythms, was suppressed into something tight and watchful. People moved faster than they should have and made less eye contact than was natural, the specific behavioral signature of a population that had been given new reasons to be careful. Selene had grown up reading rooms. She read this one the same way, not symbolically, not emotionally, but as information. The city was not celebrating Maevra's occupation. The city was waiting. That was something. They moved through the lower city in pairs at intervals, converging on the old merchant quarter where Vaelor knew a building that had been used for covert military debriefings for 20 years, and whose location had never appeared in any document Maevra's people could have accessed. Inside, by the light of a single shielded lamp, Vaelor laid out what he needed to do. "The throne room," he said. "Tomorrow. Not a siege. A presence. I walk into that room and I stand in it." "With 12 people," Ren said. "With 12 people and the Golden Heir," Vaelor said. "And I challenge her claim directly in the court, in front of every witness she's gathered to observe her consolidation." "She has 1,200 soldiers," Selene said. "She has 1,200 soldiers who are holding the capital for her claim," he said. "A claim that rests on my absence. The moment I'm not absent." "She eliminates you," Selene said. "She tries," he said. "Or she backs down in front of her own court witnesses. Either way, the claim fractures." He looked at her steadily. "Selene, the houses that haven't committed yet are waiting for evidence that I'm still a viable authority. I cannot provide that evidence from outside the walls. I have to be inside. I have to be seen. You're describing walking into the throne room on Maevra's terms. I'm describing walking in on mine," he said. "They're different." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 7 years she had spent in that palace, and the night she had left it, and every calculation she had made since then. She thought about the boy sleeping in the corner of the room against Lysa's side, the gold light making a faint warmth against the dark wall, and what it meant to bring him into the center of the thing she had spent 6 years keeping him away from. She thought about the fact that there was no outside anymore. Maevra had eliminated the outside. The herding had been effective. Standing still was losing. "We need Commander Veth's forces inside the walls before you step into that throne room," she said. "Veth can't move his Eastern Legion to Kareth in less than 3 days minimum," Vaelor said. "Not his full force," she said, "but Veth has a rapid advance unit, fast riders. 300 maybe. He could have 300 inside the city in a day and a half if he moved when he got your cipher message. I sent that message 11 days ago. Then either he's moving or he isn't," she said. "We need to know which before we walk into that throne room." "How?" "Give me until morning," she said. "I have someone in the city who might know." The someone was a woman named Hela, who ran a textile trade in the merchant quarter and who had been passing information to Selene's network for 3 years. Not Lisa's network, Selene's own, the one she had been quietly building from the fortress through the channels that Dort had not known about, because Selene had learned compartmentalization from a palace full of people who had been using it against her for 7 years. Hela was awake when Selene came to her back door before dawn, which meant she had been expecting contact, which itself was information. "Veth's advance riders crossed the eastern gate at second watch," Hela said, without preamble. 260 of them. They came in under grain merchant covers. They're quartered in the Eastern District warehouses. Selene absorbed this. He got the message. He got it, and he moved on it. Hela looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had been running information in a dangerous city for 3 years and had her own read on what it meant. "Word is spreading through the city this morning that the king is inside the walls. I don't know how it started, but it's moving fast." "Through whose network?" "That's what I can't tell you," Hela said. "It's organic looking, tavern talk, street corners. Either someone inside the Voss soldiers talked or someone in our group," Selene said. Or someone made a calculation that the rumor serves them, Hela said, carefully. Selene looked at her. Maevra, she said. If she knows you're inside the walls and she controls the rumor, Hela said, she controls the confrontation's timing. She picks the moment. She picks the ground. Selene turned and moved back toward the merchant quarter building. She had less time than she thought. She ran, not visibly. She moved fast through the alleys with Ren 2 steps behind, the specific controlled speed that was faster than walking and drew less attention than running, and she came through the merchant building's back entrance, and Vaelor was already awake and reading the set of her face correctly before she said a word. Veth is inside, she said. 260, Eastern warehouses. His whole body recalibrated, Chukat. She saw it. The soldier's readjustment when a resource he had calculated as theoretical became actual. That changes. Maevra knows we're in the city, she said. The rumor is already in the streets. She controls when this happens, not us. We have maybe 2 hours before she forces the moment on her own terms. Silence. Then we force it first, he said. Vaelor, 2 hours on her timeline or right now on ours, he said. Pick. She looked at him. She looked at the room. Lysa and the cavalry riders coming awake around them, Ren already moving to check the street outside. Kalen sitting up from his corner with clear silver eyes that had not carried the fog of just woken in years. She thought about a woman who planned 7 years out and built scaffolding for outcomes, and had been correct about almost everything, and had still, somehow, not accounted for the thing standing in the corner of this room, watching all of them with a 6-year-old's unfiltered assessment. Right now, she said. They came to the palace through the servants' corridor on the north side, which Vaelor knew from 20 years of using it for exactly this kind of entry. Not shameful, practical, the corridor that moved you through the building without the theater of the main approach when theater was a liability. They moved fast and without noise through the lower palace levels, the cavalry riders clearing each junction before the group advanced, and Selene stayed at Kalen's side with her hand on her knife, and her eyes forward and her mind running the map of the palace she had learned over 7 years, and had spent 6 more years reviewing from memory the way you reviewed things you were not certain you would ever use again. She was using them now. The throne room was ahead, and she could hear it before they reached the doors. The crowd sound of a formal court assembly, which meant Maevra had already called the court, had already gathered witnesses, had already arranged the stage she wanted for whatever she had planned. The doors were guarded. 4 Voss soldiers, heavy armed. Vaelor looked at his cavalry riders. They looked back at him. Non-lethal if you can manage it, he said. They managed it in 40 seconds. Vaelor put his hand on the throne room door. He looked at Selene. She looked back. Whatever happens in there, he said, you are not behind me. You are beside me. That is the only way I am walking through this door. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. Then she moved to stand at his left. Kalen stepped up to her right side without being asked. Vaelor pushed the door open. Eat. The throne room of Varelion was built to intimidate, which was a deliberate architectural choice of 3 generations of Dravenheart kings who understood that the first impression of power was the one that set the terms for everything that followed. It was long and high-ceilinged, with iron columns running its length and windows cut high in the stone that let in winter light in cold white bars. At its far end, on the raised platform where the Iron Throne sat, 300 years of welded-together weapons taken from defeated enemies, ugly and indestructible and unmistakable. Maevra Voss stood. She was not sitting in it. That was the one careful thing she had not yet done. She stood before it, dressed in court formal that was as close to queenly as she could manage without the crown, and she was surrounded by perhaps 60 nobles and court officials who had been assembled for whatever proceeding she had planned, and along the walls stood Voss soldiers in full arms, and the entire room swung toward the opening door with the collective movement of people who had been told something was coming and were not quite certain what form it would take. It took this form. The Alpha King of Varelion, road-worn and bearded and blood-stained at the forearm where the cut had not fully healed, walking through his own throne room doors like a man who owned them, because he did, and who had finally remembered what that meant. At his left, the woman they had declared Barren, who had walked back into the palace she had been expelled from without pausing at the threshold, whose face held nothing that looked like hesitation and everything that looked like arrival. And between them, slightly forward, a small figure with silver eyes and a pulse of gold light visible beneath the skin of his wrist, who walked into the throne room of the Varelion Empire for the first time in his life, and looked at all of it and was not frightened. The silence in the room was total. Maevra recovered first. She always recovered first. That was the skill at the center of everything she was, the ability to absorb the unexpected and reframe it before anyone in the room could see her working. "My lord," she said, and her voice was warm and arranged. "We had word you were coming. I confess we feared for your safety. The northern roads in winter are so treacherous." The smile was precise. "You should have sent word. We would have prepared a proper welcome." "I've had enough of your preparation," Vaelor said. The warmth did not leave her face, but something behind her eyes sharpened to a point. She looked at Kaelin. She looked at the gold light. And for the first time since Selene had been trying to read Maevra Voss from a distance for 6 years, she saw the woman recalculate. "The child," Maevra said. "So the stories were true." "Every one of them," Vaelor said. "He is remarkable," Maevra said, with the specific tone of someone identifying a problem while appearing to admire it. Her eyes moved across the room, touching the faces of the noble witnesses, measuring their response to what they were seeing. Though, of course, the question of legitimacy is not a question, Vaelor said. "Forgive me," Maevra said, and the warmth had a blade in it now. "But the queen was declared barren by the royal physicians. The record is clear. Whatever child this woman has produced in exile, the circumstances of his origin, the physicians were deceived," Vaelor said, "by moonroot suppression administered by Clan Voss. I have the physician's report, the independent confirmation, and the testimony of 2 sources inside your own clan's medicine records." He looked at her directly. "I also have the encoded correspondence my cipher team extracted from the officer we took at Crestfall, which details 7 years of deliberate manipulation of the royal court, including the fertility suppression, the campaign to have the queen removed, and the coordinated plan to position Clan Voss for imperial control." He let this land. The room was very still. "Copies of that correspondence," Vaelor continued, "were delivered this morning to the 8 noble houses that declined to return their seals to you, including Lord Castle, who I understand has been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation before making his position known." Maevra's face did not move. Her eyes did. "You have been busy for a man on a mountain road," she said. "My wife has been busy," he said. "I've been trying to keep up." The word landed in the room, and Selene felt it. The specific word, wife, not former queen, not the exile, not the woman he had discarded. And she felt the court witnesses register it, felt the calculation shifting in the room like weight redistributing on an uncertain floor. Maevra looked at Selene, and Selene looked back at her. In the cold white bar of winter light from the high windows, the 2 women looked at each other across the length of the throne room, and it was not the look of enemies discovering each other for the first time. It was the look of 2 people who had been moving toward this point from opposite directions for a very long time, and had always known it would arrive, and had simply been managing the intervening years as well as their respective positions allowed. "You should not have come back," Maevra said quietly, directly to Selene. "You should not have burned the farmsteads," Selene said. "It told me exactly where your network was." A beat. "Kill them," Maevra said. The Voss soldiers along the walls moved, and Kaelin stepped forward. The gold light under his wrist went from pulse to flood. It hit the room the way a wave hit a breakwater. Not violent, not targeted, but total. A pressure that moved through the stone and the air and the bones of everyone present simultaneously, and every soldier in the room stopped where they were. Not compelled, not forced, but suddenly and completely aware of something in the air that their bodies recognized as older than the orders they had been given. The wolves came through the door behind them. The timber wolves, both of them, moving through the throne room doorway like things that had been here before and were returning, and the room's air changed the way it changed before significant weather, pressure, and attention, and something that had no name for what it was except ancient. Every soldier in the room looked at the child. Maevra looked at the child. Kalen stood in the light he was making and looked at Maevra Voss with 6 years of silver eyes that had learned their steadiness from a mother who kept her spine straight when the world tried to remove it, and he said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The room made its accounting. The Voss soldiers began one by one to lower their weapons, not because they had been ordered to, because they were standing in front of something that made the orders they had been given feel like very small instructions against a very large reality. Maevra's face changed. For the first time in Selene's memory of watching that face across 7 years of political performance, it showed something unmanaged. Not fear. Maevra was not a woman who feared easily, something more precise than fear. The expression of someone who has planned with great intelligence and care, and has arrived at the moment where the intelligence and care encounter something they cannot account for, and must now decide who they are going to be in that moment. She reached into the fold of her court formal and drew the blade she kept there, short, silver-handled, the kind of knife you carried when you understood that courts were dangerous and pretty clothes were not armor, and she moved. Not toward Vaelor, toward Kalen. Vaelor was already moving. He crossed the distance between himself and his son in the specific flat-out speed of a man who had decided in the fortress courtyard that he was not going to make a particular choice again, and meant it with his entire body. Not the throne, not the politics, not the accounting of 7 years or the management of the court's witness of this moment, just the distance between himself and his child, and the blade closing it from the other side. He took the cut across his left side between the armor gap at his ribs, and it was not shallow. The sound he made was not a sound he would have made willingly. He stayed on his feet. He put himself between Maevra and Kalen, and he stayed there. And Selene was already moving from the other direction, and the knife in her hand was her mother's knife, the one with the worn handle and the single instruction attached to it. And she reached Maevra Voss in the throne room of the Empire with 7 years of humiliation and 6 years of exile and 12 days of mountain roads and one very specific promise she had made to herself in a stable in the dark at the foot of the Frostfang Mountains, all behind her in her body. And the moment stopped. Maevra looked at the knife in Selene's hand and at Selene's face, and something moved across hers. "You're going to—" "Don't," Selene said. The throne room was absolutely still. Vaelor was bleeding through his fingers where his hand pressed his ribs. Kalen stood in his gold light behind his father, and the timber wolves sat at his sides, and 60 witnesses stood along the walls of the Iron Throne's seat of power and watched the woman who had been declared barren and exiled and dismissed hold a blade to the throat of the woman who had engineered all of those things, and none of them moved, and none of them breathed, and the winter light came through the high windows cold and clean and without mercy, and the only question left in the room was the one that had always been the only real question. What kind of person would Selene choose to be in the moment when everything that had been taken from her was finally within reach of the hand that held the knife? The knife did not move. Selene stood in the winter light of the throne room with her mother's blade at Maevra Voss's throat and felt the weight of the moment, not the theatrical weight of a story reaching its appointed end, but the actual physical weight of years, the accumulated density of every choice that had led her body to this exact position in this exact room with this exact woman in front of her. She felt her own pulse. Steady. Slower than it should have been, perhaps, given the circumstances, but the steadiness was not calm, and it was not numbness. It was the quality of attention that arrives when a person has been moving toward something for so long that reaching it does not produce excitement, but instead a kind of crystalline clarity. Every detail sharp, every variable present, the mind working without the static of panic, because the panic had been burned off years ago in a stable at the foot of the mountains in the dark. Maevra did not move. She was a woman who understood threat assessment, and what she was assessing right now was the face of the person holding the blade. And what Selene's face was telling her was not rage or grief, or the satisfying operatic fury of a wronged woman arriving at her reckoning. It was something harder to read than any of those things. It was the face of someone making a decision rather than acting on an impulse, and decisions were more dangerous than impulses because they held. "You're not going to kill me," Maevra said. Her voice was very controlled, a thin control, the kind that was working hard, but present. Tell me why you believe that, Selene said. Because you're not that kind of person. You've been watching me for 7 years, Selene said. Through a midwife you owned and a rotation schedule in 4 years of my son's life. And your conclusion from all of that is that you know what kind of person I am. Maevra's jaw tightened fractionally. You're the kind of person who let Dort walk out a postern gate, Maevra said, when you could have done otherwise. I let her walk because she was afraid and had a daughter, and made a choice that fear and love together produce in people who don't have better options, Selene said. That's not mercy. That's accounting. She held the blade steady. You had better options than Dort. You had resources and position and access and time. You chose to use all of them to poison a woman's body so you could control an empire's future. That's a different category. Yes, Maevra said, flat, without apology. It is. Selene looked at her. In the room behind her, she could hear Vaelor's breathing, which was not the breathing of a man managing well. The wet-edged sound of someone absorbing pain in the way they'd been trained to absorb it, which was efficiently and without display. She could hear Kaelin's breathing, which was the breathing of a 6-year-old holding very still because he understood this was not a moment for movement. She could hear 60 witnesses trying not to make sound. You built something extraordinary, Selene said to Maevra. 7 years, a long game, real intelligence in every stage of it. She paused. And you pointed it at the wrong things. Something moved across Maevra's face. Not anger, something more complicated. The wrong things, she repeated. You wanted the throne, Selene said, not what the throne was for. You wanted the power without the purpose, which is why you ran it through poison and substitution and manufactured barrenness instead of through anything that could have stood in daylight. She felt her own words settle as she said them, the way things settled when they were true rather than constructed. Vaelor made the same error for 15 years. He wanted the empire without the people inside it. You both built magnificent structures with nothing worth living in at their center. Maevra looked at her. And you're different, she said with an edge. I'm not better, Selene said. I'm just the one who got educated faster because the cost of my mistakes was immediate and personal and had a face. She thought of Kaelin at 2 years old, learning to walk in the fortress yard with the pack wolves watching. You never paid for your mistakes immediately. Everything was deferred. Deferred payments accumulate interest. The room was very quiet. So what happens now? Maevra asked. Selene looked at her for a long moment. Then she lowered the knife. The room's collective breath came out. Maevra's eyes flickered. Surprise, recalculation, the rapid assessment of what a lowered blade meant in tactical terms. What happens now, Selene said, is that you are taken into custody by the court, and the documentation of what Clan Voss did is entered into the imperial record, and you are tried under the laws of Varelion by a proceeding that I intend to ensure is actually conducted according to those laws, which means you will have representation and evidence and a proceeding that can be reviewed and verified. She held Maevra's gaze. I am not going to kill you in the throne room, not because I lack the capacity or the reason, because killing you here is the same kind of power that built everything that's been wrong with this empire, and I am finished operating in that vocabulary. Maevra looked at her, at the knife in her hand, at the room around them. You're going to give me a fair trial, she said. I'm going to ensure one exists, Selene said. What it concludes is between you and the evidence. A long beat. You know what's remarkable, Maevra said quietly, is that I genuinely did not account for this. I know, Selene said. That's the thing about playing a long game against people you've underestimated. Eventually, the variable you dismissed shows up in a category you didn't prepare for. She stepped back. She looked at Vaelor's cavalry riders, who had held position through all of it. Take her into custody, she said. Gently. She goes to the holding chamber in the east wing, guarded by royal soldiers, not Voss fighters. And someone get the king a physician before he bleeds through the floor of his own throne room. Psha. Vaelor did not want to sit down. This was predictable, and she dealt with it the way she dealt with most predictable things, which was to not argue and to simply position the chair where the sitting down was going to happen one way or another, and let him make the choice between accepting the chair or arriving at the floor. He chose the chair. The palace physician, a young man named Orvath, who had been in residence long enough to serve 3 administrations, and who had the specific, careful neutrality of a person who had learned to do his work regardless of who was currently occupying the upper floors, worked on the wound at Vaelor's ribs with the methodical focus of someone who had seen worse and was determined not to see it become worse. Selene stood nearby and watched. The wound was deep but had not hit anything that could not recover, which was the particular luck of an injury sustained by a man who had spent 15 years in military combat and had developed at a cellular level the habit of positioning his body in ways that maximized the margin between a blade and the things he needed to keep functioning. Even in the moment of intercepting Maevra's strike, some part of his body had been doing the geometry. "Hold still," Orvath said, for the 3rd time. "I am holding still," Vaelor said. "You are breathing in a way that is technically still, but is making my work harder," Orvath said, with the resigned precision of a physician who had been saying this to kings for 20 years. Vaelor looked at Selene. She looked back at him without expression. He exhaled once, deliberately, and held still. Kaelin was sitting on a low bench against the wall of the antechamber, with Lysa beside him and a cup of something hot in his hands, and he was watching his father get stitched up with the focused attention of someone cataloging information they intended to keep. The gold light under his wrist had settled back to its ordinary pulse, the soft, steady rhythm that Selene had been watching for 6 years. He looked tired. The deep tiredness of a child who had spent extraordinary energy on something extraordinary, the particular bone-deep quality of it that she recognized from the nights after he'd done significant things with the wolves. She went and sat beside him. He leaned into her without looking up from his father. "He did it on purpose," Kaelin said. "Yes. He knew she was going for me, and he put himself in the way." "Yes." The boy was quiet for a moment, processing. "Before, in the yard at home, you said he was complicated. I remember. Is this part of the complicated?" She looked at Vaelor across the room, at the set of his jaw while Orvath worked, at the way he was keeping his breathing disciplined, not for his own comfort, but because the physician had asked him to, and he had registered that the physician's work mattered more than his own preference in this moment. A thing he would not have done, the Vaelor she had known. That man had not been capable of registering that another person's work mattered more than his own preference. He had been incapable of it not through cruelty, but through the fundamental structure of how he understood the world, which was a structure in which his preferences were the architecture and everything else was furniture. "The complicated part," she said to her son, "is that people can be multiple things across time. The person who made the wrong choices and the person who is in the process of making different ones can be the same person. That's not a contradiction, that's just how change works when it's real." Kaelin considered this. "Does it mean you trust him?" he asked. "It means I'm watching," she said. "Trust is built in increments. It doesn't come from a single good act, no matter how significant the act is." "Even that act?" She looked at the man across the room who had put his body between a blade and their son. "Even that act," she said. "It matters. It will always matter. But trust is what accumulates over time, and we don't have time yet. We have a start." Kaelin nodded slowly. "I think he knows that," the boy said. "What makes you say so?" "He's not asking you for anything," Kaelin said. "He's just there, doing what needs doing, not asking." She looked at her son. 6 years old, watching an adult situation with the precise and uncluttered eyes of a child who had grown up in a place where honesty was the primary language and manipulation had been kept out because she had kept it out deliberately, because she had understood from the beginning that the best protection she could give him was a clear map of what people actually were rather than what they performed. He was using that map now. "When did you get so perceptive?" she said. "I've always been perceptive," he said, without pride, as a simple statement of observable fact. "You told me to pay attention to what people do, not what they say. I've been doing that." "Yes," she said, "you have." She put her arm around him, and he settled his head against her shoulder, and they sat together and watched Orvath finish his work on the wound that had been taken on purpose. And the antechamber was warm, and the winter light through the windows had shifted to the late afternoon gold of a day that had contained more weight than most days were built to carry. And for a moment, Nothing was required of either of them, except to be still. The court assembly that followed took 3 days, not the dramatic single-session reckoning of stories, but the grinding procedural work of a political situation being dismantled and restructured. Testimony, documentation, the review of Voss clan records going back 7 years, the questioning of nobles who had signed their seals and were now presenting various textures of regret, the patient reconstruction of what had been done to whom and when and with what deliberate intent. Selene ran it. Vaelor signed the authority that enabled it to run and then stepped aside from the daily operation of it, which was either the most significant act of trust he could have demonstrated or a tactical calculation that this particular process would go better under her management, and she suspected it was both and accepted both. She worked 16 hours a day for 3 days, which was the work she had been doing in one form or another for 6 years, and which her body and mind handled with the efficiency of long practice. Lysa organized the documentation. Commander Veth's legal officer provided the imperial legal framework. 3 independent scribes recorded everything in parallel so that no single record could be altered without the others contradicting it. On the first evening, Vaelor came to the records room where she was still working at the late hour and set a plate of food on the table beside her without comment, and sat down across from her and began reading the day's compiled testimony without being asked, flagging items with the specific tactical eye of someone who understood evidence and its applications. She did not thank him. She did not need to. They worked in silence for 2 hours, and the silence had a different quality than any silence they had shared in 7 years of the same palace. Not the silence of 2 people in the same space failing to connect, but the silence of 2 people in the same work, which was a completely different architecture. On the second day, the surviving Voss clan leadership sent a representative to negotiate terms, and the representative was a cautious man who had clearly been briefed to open with the suggestion that the full weight of accountability might fall more constructively on individuals rather than the whole clan structure. Selene heard him out. Then she explained with great precision and without raising her voice that the documentation in the imperial record detailed coordinated clan-level activity across 7 years, involving clan resources, clan medicine stores, clan military forces, and clan financial infrastructure, and that the distinction between individual and organizational accountability was therefore not one the evidence supported. The representative left. The negotiation resumed the following morning with different terms. On the third day, Maevra's proceeding reached its conclusion. Selene sat in the chair to Vaelor's left through the formal reading, and she listened to the verdict with her hands folded on the table and her face doing nothing that was not required. And when it was over, she stood and walked out of the chamber and went to the east-facing corridor that overlooked the palace gardens, and stood in the cold air coming through the stone archways, and breathed. She had not asked for the death sentence. She had made that position known at the beginning, and she had held it through 3 days of pressure from multiple directions. From Vaelor's remaining court officials, who argued that mercy invited repetition, from Commander Veth, who was more pragmatic than ideological, but had a soldier's understanding of what leaving capable enemies alive produced, from 3 noble houses who had delayed their seal of support for Maevra and now wanted something visible in return for their delayed loyalty. Exile. Permanent. Stripped of clan authority and imperial access and the network she had built. Confined to the Western territories with a garrison that was not punishment but was enforcement. It was not a satisfying verdict in the way that satisfying verdicts were supposed to feel in stories. It was the verdict that Selene could stand behind when she examined it in the cold light of the question she had been asking herself since the stable at the foot of the mountains. What kind of person was she going to choose to be? She had answered it in the throne room with the lowered knife. She did not need to answer it again with something worse. Footsteps in the corridor. She knew the weight of them without turning. "The Western garrison is reliable," Vaelor said, coming to stand beside her. He was moving better than the day before, which meant Orvath's work was holding. "She won't build anything out of it." "She might," Selene said. "She's intelligent." "Yes. We should watch the Western correspondence carefully for the first several years. I'll assign someone to it." A pause. "Someone we've vetted personally." She looked at the garden below. The winter had stripped the ornamental trees to their bare architectures, and the frozen paths ran between them in the geometric patterns that 3 generations of Dravenheart gardeners had maintained. And somewhere in the middle of the garden, a small figure in a dark coat was moving along one of the paths with 2 enormous pale wolves flanking him, and the boy's silver eyes were turned up to the sky as though he was reading something in it that only he could see. "He loves it out there," she said. "He's been out every morning," Vaelor said, "before anyone else is awake." "He does that at home too." She paused. "At the fortress." A careful pause from him. "Is it still home?" he asked. She considered the question. "It's where I built something. That doesn't stop being true because something new has started." She watched her son stop in the garden path and crouch down, and one of the timber wolves put its muzzle to his face with a gentleness that the size of the animal should have made impossible. "He'll want to go back, to see Lysa and Ren and the walls and the places he grew up in." "Then we'll go," Vaelor said. She looked at him. "Whenever he wants," Vaelor said. "It doesn't have to be a choice between the two." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's a very different answer than the one you would have given 8 years ago." "Yes," he said. "It is." "What changed?" He looked out at the garden, at the boy, and the wolves moving along the bare-branched paths. "I spent 15 years being certain," he said. "Certain about what the Empire needed. Certain about what strength looked like. Certain about what you were and were not." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again the words came out without the management that most of his words had, the specific unguarded quality of something said at the end of a long road when the energy for performance has run out. Certainty is a very comfortable place to live. Very easy, very clean, and completely incompatible with anything that's actually alive and changing and worth being near. She looked at him. "I was wrong about you," he said. "Not in the way that can be fixed by knowing the truth. The wrong was in the kind of looking I was doing, not the information I had. Even if no one had poisoned anything, even without Maevra, I was already looking at you as a component of an empire rather than a person inside one." He held her gaze. "I don't know how to undo 7 years. I don't think you can. But I know what I was, and I know that's not what I intend to be. And I understand that the distance between those two things is something I have to demonstrate rather than declare." The cold air came through the stone archways. Below, Kalen stood up from his crouch and looked toward the palace, and across the distance and the winter garden his silver eyes found the corridor where they stood, and the boy lifted one hand in the particular wave that meant he had registered their presence and was fine and they should not worry, which was the gesture she had taught him, and which he had turned into his own, and the small, ordinary human gesture of it, the child's uncomplicated hand in the winter air, hit her somewhere between the ribs in a way that had nothing to do with politics or power or any of the machinery of the past weeks. She breathed. "I'm not going to tell you it's forgiven," she said, "because forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once. It's something you do repeatedly and imperfectly over a long time." She looked at him directly. "What I can tell you is that I'm not finished, I'm not closed, and what I build from here I intend to build clearly, without the things that were built before on foundations that were hidden from me." He received this without trying to shape it into something more or less than what it was. "That's enough," he said. "That is genuinely enough." She looked back at the garden. "Go down there," she said quietly. He looked at her. "He's been watching you," she said. "Carefully, the way he watches everything. He's been building a picture." She paused. "Go be in the picture, not as a king, as a person in a garden on a winter afternoon." Vaelor was quiet for a moment. She could feel the particular quality of his stillness, the Alpha King's habitual resistance to any direction he had not originated, and the thing that had grown up alongside it over the past weeks, the newer thing that understood that resistance had been costing him everything worth having. He pushed off the wall. She heard his footsteps move down the corridor and then down the stairs, and she stayed at the archway and watched him emerge from the palace entrance into the garden, and watched her son look up at the sound of his approach, and watched the two of them occupy the same space for the first time without anyone's life depending on the immediate outcome. She did not watch what happened next. She turned and walked back through the corridor and gave them the privacy of a moment that did not require her management. Some things needed room to find their own shape. The coronation of Kaelin Dravenheart as the Golden Heir of Varelion took place 6 weeks later, when the worst of the winter had passed and the roads were open enough for the noble houses to send their representatives to Kareth. It was not the spectacle that such occasions had historically been. Selene had a hand in that, and she used the hand without apology. The bloated ceremonial architecture of the Varelion court had always served the same function that bloated ceremonial architecture served everywhere: to overwhelm individual judgment with collective awe, to make the proceedings feel inevitable and therefore unchallengeable, to position power as something that descended from above rather than something that was assembled from accountable human choices. She stripped the ceremony back. The throne room was full but not packed. The witnesses were the noble houses and Commander Veth's representatives, and the heads of the merchant guilds, and 3 delegations from the border territories that had historically been excluded from court proceedings of this kind, which Selene had changed specifically and on the record. The ceremony was conducted in the clear, plain language of the imperial charter rather than the archaic formal that most of the attendees could not actually parse, which meant everyone in the room understood what was being said as it was said, and understanding was not compatible with uncritical awe. Kaelin stood through it with the gravity that he brought to things he had decided mattered. He was 6 years old and very small against the scale of the throne room, and the gold light under his wrist was visible to everyone present, a steady pulse that cast its faint warmth in all directions. And the enormous timber wolves sat at his left and right like old soldiers called back to a post they had been waiting to return to. When the formal language was done and the heir's mark was registered in the imperial record, Vaelor looked at his son for a long moment. Then he crouched to the boy's level in front of 60 witnesses and every representative of the Empire's major power structures, and he said something quiet to him that Selene could not hear from where she stood. Kaelin listened. Then he nodded, once, the same nod she had watched him give his whole life, the nod that meant he had considered something seriously and accepted it. He looked up at his father with those silver eyes. "I know," the boy said, loud enough to carry. "I'll be better." The room was very quiet. Vaelor rose. He looked at Selene. Something in the look had no precedent in their 7 years of shared history. It was not the look of a king acknowledging a political alliance, and it was not the look of a man managing his presentation to a court of witnesses, and it was not the performance of any sentiment for the consumption of an audience. It was the look of a person who had survived being entirely wrong, and had come through it smaller in the ways that smallness was necessary, and larger in the ways that mattered, and who was standing in the wreckage and the possibility of a life he had not had the imagination to build before, and was beginning, imperfectly and with full awareness of the imperfection, to build it now. She gave him nothing back that she did not feel. What she felt was not simple. It had not been simple for 7 years and was not going to become simple now, and the absence of simplicity was not a problem to solve but a reality to inhabit, which was the thing she had learned in the years between the palace and the fortress, that the complicated texture of a life actually lived was not a failure of resolution. It was what resolution actually felt like when it was real. She nodded. Not forgiveness, not yet, or not entirely. Not love, not in the clean, uncomplicated sense of a thing that had never been broken. Something more durable than either. The acknowledgement of a person standing in the same room with another person who had done harm and was trying, visibly, and without guarantee of outcome, not to be the version of themselves that had done it. That was a beginning. Beginnings were enough, if you understood that the work of them was long. Mekit. The months that followed were the most difficult and the most real that Selene had experienced since the night she had walked out of the palace with nothing but a gray horse and a locked wooden box and a child she had not yet told anyone about. They were difficult in the ordinary ways that rebuilding was difficult. The grinding legislative work of dismantling the corruption the Voss clan had embedded in the court structures, the careful and politically treacherous process of rebalancing the noble houses, the institutional changes she had been planning in the back of her mind for 6 years, about the laws that governed bloodline politics and the protections that did not yet exist for heirs born outside the main palace and children born to exiled mothers and women whose bodies had been used as political instruments. She wrote those laws herself. She had help. Lysa, who had returned to Kareth at Selene's request. and who had the archive knowledge to ensure everything was correctly grounded in the existing charter framework, and Commander Vet's legal officer, and 2 nobles from houses that had demonstrated throughout the crisis the rarest quality of all, which was the willingness to be uncertain rather than falsely certain, and to act from that uncertainty with care rather than suppressing it with performance. The laws did not pass easily. Nothing that redistributed power ever passed easily. There were arguments in the council chamber that went on for hours, and there were days when the resistance of the entrenched made her feel the specific exhaustion of pushing against something that did not want to move, and she absorbed the exhaustion and kept pushing. Vaelor did not lead those efforts. He was present in them, and his authority was the structural backing that made certain rooms possible to enter, and he used it when she needed it, and stayed out of her way when she didn't. And the calibration of when to do which was something he had gotten wrong twice and right many more times, and he had taken the corrections when they came without making her wrong for offering them. That was the work. Not the dramatic scenes, not the moments that made for good telling. The daily practice of 2 people rebuilding something that had been built wrong the first time, without a template for what the right version looked like because the right version was being invented as they went. Kalen grew. He grew the way the children of hard places grew, with a weight to his presence that had nothing to do with seriousness and everything to do with having been trusted early with real things. He was not a solemn child. He laughed easily and had opinions about everything and could be deeply unreasonable about food and could also, without transition, sit in absolute stillness in the palace garden for an hour, watching something no one else could see. The timber wolves had become a permanent feature of the palace grounds, which the court had found deeply alarming and had eventually accepted as simply the reality of what the Golden Heir was, the way you accepted weather. He asked questions that Selene answered honestly when she could, and said, "I don't know," when she couldn't. He asked Vaelor questions too, which happened with increasing frequency as the months passed, and the shape of something between them solidified through the accumulation of ordinary shared time, meals and lessons and evenings in the records room, and the long walks through the winter garden that Vaelor had made a habit, which Kalen had made a habit of joining without being invited and without being discouraged. She did not observe these closely. She trusted what her son's silver eyes could assess, and trusted that he would tell her what he concluded in his own time and in his own way. He told her on an evening in early spring, when the garden had come back from the winter and the ornamental trees were beginning their first tentative green, and the light lasted longer than it had, and the air had lost its killing edge. They were sitting on the low wall at the garden's edge, the 2 of them, the way they had sat by the fire in the fortress through 6 years of evenings. "He's trying," Kalen said. Not as a question. "Yes," she said. "Not performing trying. Actually trying." "I know." "You can tell the difference," the boy said. "Because performing trying looks outward. You do it where people can see it. Actually trying happens when no one's watching." She looked at her son. "No one's been watching him in the evenings," Kalen said. "In the garden, just me. And he's the same." She did not say anything for a moment. "That matters," she said finally. "Yeah," Kalen said. "I thought so." They sat together on the wall in the spring evening, and below them the garden held its new green, and the wolves moved along the paths in their unhurried way, and the palace rose behind them with all its complicated history and its stones. And the empire was not fixed and was not healed and was not the version of itself that anyone would have designed from the beginning. It was the version that had survived a war. It had partly made and was in the long, slow work of becoming something that could be accountable to the people inside it. That work would outlast all of them. That was not a sad thought. That was the actual shape of things worth building. There was a night, late in the spring, when Selene stood alone on the high corridor that looked down into the throne room. The room was empty at that hour. The torches at the far end threw their orange light across the iron columns and the stone floor, and the iron throne at the room's far end. 300 years of welded weapons holding the shape of a thing that had been contested and bled over and rebuilt in every generation and would be again in the generations that followed hers. It was ugly and indestructible and entirely without sentiment about what it represented. She had spent 7 years afraid of that room in the way you were afraid of something that had the power to define you. She had spent the last 6 months working in it. She was not afraid of it anymore. Not because the room had changed, but because she understood now what the room actually was. A space where choices were made, and the quality of the choices was not inherent in the room, but in the people who stood in it, and the people could be different, and she was one of the people now, and different was therefore possible. She thought about the woman who had walked out of this palace 6 years ago with nothing, and had walked back in with everything she had built in the years between. And she understood that the distance between those two people was not the story of a woman recovering what had been taken from her. It was the story of a woman discovering that the thing she had built in exile was more substantive than anything the palace had ever offered, and that she was bringing it back with her not because she needed what the palace had, but because the palace needed what she had built, power as gift rather than acquisition. That was the principle she had kept trying to find the language for, through all the legislation and all the council sessions and all the long evenings in the records room, power that pointed outward, toward the people it was supposed to serve rather than inward, toward the person holding it. It was not a revolutionary idea. It was one of the oldest ideas there was, so old that every empire in history had inscribed it somewhere in its founding documents and then systematically failed to practice it because practice was harder than inscription and the failure always accumulated quietly, in small concessions and comfortable blindnesses until the accumulation reached a crisis. Her job, and Vaelor's job, and eventually Kaelin's job, was to fail at it less than the generations before them had. That was the available ambition. Footsteps in the corridor. She recognized them. Vaelor came and stood beside her at the rail, looking down into the empty throne room, and she let him be there without adjusting her own position. Orvath says the scar is finished, he said. Good. It pulls when the weather's cold. He looked at the throne room below. I don't mind it. She looked at him. I know that sounds... No, she said. I understand. He looked at her. Some marks are the record of a choice, she said, not a wound, the record of what you decided when you had to decide. Yes, he said. That's it exactly. They stood in the corridor in the spring night, looking down at the room that had held the weight of everything they had put each other through and survived, and were in the slow work of trying to become different on the other side of. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because the silence had become one of the ones that did not require filling. Then he said very quietly, I'm sorry. Not the first time he had said it, not performed. The particular flatness of a truth that had been true for a long time, and was being stated again not for her benefit, but because it was still true, and he intended to keep knowing it. She breathed once. I know, she said. Not yet forgiven, not entirely, or not in the way the word was used when it meant closed and done and filed away. Forgiven in the ongoing sense of a thing you came back to and worked at and held up to the light to see what was actually left of it, because that was how real things were forgiven. Not in a single moment, but in the daily decision to keep moving forward without allowing the past's worst version of itself to determine the future's possibilities. She thought of Kaelin on the garden wall saying, he's the same when no one's watching. She thought of the stable in the dark at the foot of the mountains and her own hand against her stomach and the promise she had made. She thought of everything that had been built in the space between that promise and this corridor, all the difficult ordinary labor of it, all the things that had cost more than she had expected and produced more than she had planned. She thought of the boy sleeping somewhere in this palace right now with 2 ancient timber wolves at his door and silver eyes that watched the world with the clear attention of someone who had been given honest tools from the beginning and trusted to use them. We have work tomorrow, she said. We do, he agreed. Then let's not waste the night standing here. She turned from the railing and walked back through the corridor, and he fell into step beside her. Beside, not behind, the way she had required in the throne room doorway, and the way it had stayed since then, the arrangement of people who were figuring out how to move in the same direction without one becoming the shadow of the other. They walked through the palace corridors in the quiet of the spring night, and the torches threw their ordinary light, and somewhere below them in the garden, the wolves moved their slow patrol, and in the east wing a small boy slept with his pulse throwing its gold light against the dark. The empire was not saved. It was in the long hard work of saving itself, which was a different thing, And the work would be imperfect and would stumble and would require correction and would produce people in future generations who forgot what it had cost and would need to be reminded. But tonight the work was done, and the spring was here, and the corridor was quiet, and two people who had done genuine damage to each other and genuine damage to themselves were walking through a palace they were trying to make worth living in. And that was not a small thing. That was in fact the only kind of ending worth trusting. Not the triumphant kind, where everything was resolved and the ledger balanced and the future was guaranteed, the living kind, where what you had survived had changed you into someone capable of doing better, and better was all that was on offer, and better was enough. That was enough. That was everything.